The weeping man's name was Phoenix Exer, the Empire's finest knight and second son of Duke Exer. This illustrious figure now lay sprawled on the lawn, drunk and sobbing, the reason being his beloved younger sister. The youngest daughter of the Exer family was an imposter. The girl hadn't expected him to carry on like this in front of the servants. She had intended to slip away after saying her goodbyes, but Phoenix was making it difficult. To console him, she told him he should pull himself together and think of his health, for only then could he achieve anything. She felt she'd played her part long enough, and seeing no reason to linger, she took her leave. Otherwise, he might soon find the real Duke's daughter, not the fake. The one who exposed the fake sister, and the one Phoenix was looking for, the real younger sister, was this very girl, the daughter of Duke Exiled, of the most noble family in the Eastern Empire. Within this seemingly flawless aristocratic family lay a hidden secret. The truth was, the Duke's youngest daughter had been cast out by her own family due to the circumstances of her birth. The Duke's household later, belatedly, had a change of heart and began searching for the missing girl, but all evidence pointed to the child's death. Years later, a girl arrived at the Exile estate, claiming to be the Duke's daughter, abandoned in her childhood. All the members of the Exile family apologized to her for what she had endured, rejoiced that she had finally returned to them, and accepted her as one of their own. From then on, she lived a life of extravagant luxury, displaying a peculiar attitude towards others. Her beauty and demeanor were the subject of daily gossip, but this didn't last long, as after a while, the woman was revealed to be a fraud. Thanks to her, Perrianne, the Duke's real daughter and a spy for the Rococo Holy Kingdom, was able to make her appearance. As the true daughter of the Duke's household, she had every reason to do so. After being expelled from the Duke's estate due to the uncertain circumstances of her birth, Perrianne's life had become a living hell. After enduring countless hardships and teetering on the brink of death, Her Majesty, the Queen of the Holy Kingdom, took her in. Upon learning of Perrianne's true parentage, the Queen trained her as a spy to repay the debt of her life being saved. Perrianne dedicated herself wholeheartedly to this role for 15 years. Her Majesty informed Perrianne that the Duchess had found their daughter. Knowing that this girl was an imposter, the Queen ordered Perrianne to infiltrate the Duke's household and ascertain the imposter's identity. The Queen demanded caution, ensuring that the planned marriage between the Duke's false daughter and a member of the Western Empire would not take place. And so, Perrianne agreed, accepting her mission and returning to the Exile estate. She had once dreamt of a reunion with her family, but she'd reasoned that such things only happened in fairy tales. Now, she harbored no such illusions. Perrianne observed her second older brother, seemingly in shock. But if he couldn't even recognize his own sister right in front of him, did familial affection even matter to him? Perhaps today would be the last day she'd witness such absurdity. Having fully accomplished her mission of exposing the fraud and disrupting the marriage, she now needed to attend to her own affairs and return to the kingdom to report to her mother, the Queen. She noticed a commotion in the hall, the maids whispering amongst themselves. What should she do? Finally, her gaze landed on the man with blood on his face. She recognized him as Larry Exer, Duke Exer's eldest son and heir to the dukedom. The maids were whispering amongst themselves, saying he'd smashed a whiskey bottle with his bare hands, painting the room with blood. He was apparently devastated by the news about the fake young lady. Perrianne thought to herself, if they abandoned me all those years ago, why are they suffering so much now? She found herself awkwardly locking eyes with the Duke's son. She felt his gaze upon her, strange and unsettling, but she knew that none of this concerned her anymore. A sense of foreboding washed over her, and she decided to leave as quickly as possible. But just then, a servant called out to Miss Perrianne, informing her that Master Larian wished to see her. Perrianne entered his office, his gaze striking her as somewhat sinister. Larry had a proposition for her, but he stressed that it was not just a proposition, but a plea. Perrianne seethed with anger that he couldn't even recognize her at such close proximity. When faced with one's own blood, instinct should be more accurate than reason. There is a saying that intuition often held the answer. She had scoffed at such notions, but after 15 years, riding home in the carriage, perhaps she had secretly been hoping for something, clinging to a phantom hope. A hope that her family would recognize her instantly. Returning to Larian's request, he proposed that Perrianne stay as their solace. Perrianne was bewildered, but Larian continued, explaining that since the girl impersonating his sister had been caught, they needed someone to take her place. to play the part of his deceased sister, to keep a face that resembled hers within the household, to serve as a comfort, a reminder of the child they had lost. Perrianne thought he was mad. He wanted to keep her like a doll, a memento of his dead sister, simply because she looked like her. She possessed the perfect persona crafted by the Holy Kingdom, unsuspicious in this situation, but these brothers seemed utterly deranged. She reasoned that since they had abandoned her in the first place, they should simply live with the consequences. It was their choice to turn their backs on her. Perrianne refused the proposition. She had no intention of serving as a replacement for the Duke's deceased daughter, a balm for their grief. What they truly needed, she thought, was common sense and a psychiatrist. Approximately 26 years ago, the Exer family welcomed their third child. The Duke and Duchess, renowned for their loving relationship, were blessed for a third time. With 2 sons already, the birth of a daughter was joyous news. But upon their first glimpse of the newborn, no one could speak. For the child's hair was neither the midnight hue of the Duke's, nor the shimmering gold of the Duchess's, but chestnut brown. This was the beginning of the tragedy. The Exer family carried the blood of dragons, marked by 2 distinct traits signifying their lineage. The first, psychic power, wielded from birth like a sword, a substitute for magic. The second, hair as dark as the night sky, a color that had to be present in all direct descendants. Yet, the child born to the Duchess possessed brown hair. This anomaly could only point to one explanation. The Duchess had been unfaithful. Whispers followed the Duke's shocking public declaration of the child as his own. Even after the birth of a brown-haired daughter, he maintained unwavering faith in his wife, the Duchess, and believed the child, incapable of wielding spirit power, was his. The Duke's adoration for his wife and daughter silenced the vassals who insisted on questioning the Duchess. The girl was raised as a little princess until tragedy struck. The Duchess, along with her daughter, returned to her family estate. Dozens of knights, servants, and maids perished in the ensuing violence, an event later dubbed the Duchess Exer murder case. It was a murder case devoid of evidence. Yet even amidst this tragedy, a miracle emerged. Perrianne survived. The child's unscathed survival implied the mother's selfless protection, a sacrifice the Duke instantly understood. Only 3 years old at the time, Perrianne remained oblivious to the Duke's inner turmoil, consumed only by an immeasurable longing for her mother. In the aftermath, as the dukedom descended into chaos, the servants, themselves disoriented, struggled to care for her. A lonely, grieving child, she found solace in the simple act of playing with the earth. It was in this moment that she first discovered her ability to manipulate the very ground beneath her fingers. This, ultimately, would be her undoing. For while the descendants of the Exer family could wield spirit power, the use of magic was strictly forbidden. Unaware of this prohibition, Perrianne crafted a doll resembling her mother, eager to present it to the Duke. She was oblivious to the fact that the Duke was meeting with a man claiming to be her true father. Her display of magic unveiled the secret the Duke Exer had been meticulously ignoring. To compound her misfortune, she was placed in the care of the man who claimed paternity, though it was clear to anyone with eyes that he was not her father. After the Duke relinquished her, she began her life within a monster research tower. Within the tower's confines, loneliness and anguish became her constant companions. She believed her imprisonment was a consequence of her own flaws. Perrianne convinced herself that she was the source of ugliness, and if only she could make things right, her father's love would return. Clinging to this hope, she crafted more and more dolls, each a miniature replica of her family. One day, a visitor arrived at her prison. Hope flickered within her, hope that it was her father, her family, come to retrieve her. But the figure who appeared was neither father nor brother. It was Maman Roki, ruler of the Rococo Holy Kingdom, the woman who would become her mother. This marked the first encounter between the young girl and Her Majesty. Maman declared her intention to take Perrianne away. The girl vividly remembered that moment, the first time she felt the warmth of a savior. From that point forward, she vowed to live for Her Majesty. Before infiltrating the Duke Exer's domain, Perrianne wandered the capital of the Rococo Holy Kingdom. She contemplated the challenges faced by the queen in maintaining sovereignty, a kingdom wedged precariously between two powerful empires. She pondered her infiltration strategy. Perhaps it would be wiser to wait until reaching the Eastern Empire. Lost in thought, Perrianne chewed her food, a peculiar taste registering on her tongue. It was a sleeping pill. After the success of their plan, the two conspirators blindfolded Perrianne and ushered her into a carriage. The blindfold, however, was useless against Perrianne. Her magic, intertwined with the very earth, filtered everything she absorbed. Even the deadliest poisons held no sway over her. She decided to feign vulnerability lest she arouse suspicion. Still unsure of their identities or their motives, Perrianne resolved to play along and uncover the truth behind this abduction. It was then that the blindfold was removed. Standing before her was Exer, the former Duke of the Exer Duchy, the very man who had cast her into the depths of the monster research tower, her own father. Her mind raced, trying to decipher what he wanted from the Rococo Holy Kingdom and why he had orchestrated her kidnapping. Though he had relinquished his title, his influence still rippled throughout the empire. What could this monstrous man, who clung to youth through martial prowess, possibly want with her? Could he know of her plan to infiltrate the duchy and disrupt his false daughter's impending marriage? Exer introduced himself and apologized for his heavy-handed methods, swearing he meant her no harm. Perrianne, wary, questioned why a man of his stature would need her. Exer replied that he had a proposition, a job offer. The former duke began to list known facts about her. 25 years of age, born in the Rococo Holy Kingdom, orphaned, a graduate of a prestigious Western Empire university, currently unemployed and prone to frequent job changes. Then, he laid bare his proposal. He wanted her to become his daughter's personal maid. A position as the Duchess's handmaiden was a coveted role, even among noble women. Why her? There was a reason, he explained. Choosing someone from the Eastern Empire would lead to speculation about the duchy's intentions, based on the young lady's background and family connections. Such a choice could inadvertently empower a rival family or necessitate the control of another. This was unacceptable. However, Perrianne, the daughter of a deceased viscount from the Rococo Holy Kingdom, presented the ideal circumstances. But there was another, more sinister reason for her recruitment. The former duke asked Perrianne if she was familiar with the custom of the shadow double. He explained that it was an ancient practice of using a look-alike as a decoy during times of conflict, a tactic employed only in bygone eras when people rarely traveled and faces were unfamiliar. Exer claimed to possess a legendary artifact capable of altering a person's appearance without leaving any magical trace. However, for it to function, the caster and the target needed to share some resemblance. Perrianne was surprised that such a fabled artifact served such a limited purpose. Exer added that even ordinary individuals without magical abilities could use the artifact once, the effect lasting for several months. With Perrianne's likeness, activating the artifact would be simple. The decision now rested with her. Perrianne clarified her role, to impersonate a maid in everyday life and serve as a double in emergencies. The former duke confirmed, stating that in times of trouble, a maid would die in her stead. He had chosen Perrianne precisely because she had no family to object. He saw her as nothing more than a tool. While this facilitated her infiltration of the duchy, Perrianne, the thought that he would endanger his own flesh and blood, Perrianne, to protect a false daughter, wounded her deeply. She ached for herself, having eagerly anticipated this reunion with her father, only to be met with not only a failure to recognize her, but also such a repulsive proposition. The girl inquired if there was any freedom of choice in the matter. The Duke replied that they needed someone willing, as it was difficult to rely on someone coerced to perform adequately in crucial moments. He added that if she suddenly wished to refuse, she could simply drink the tea offered, and the conversation would end. The tea was laced with a hallucinogen designed to erase the memory of the preceding 5 hours upon consumption. The Duke attempted to reassure her that it was merely for secrecy and the ingredients were safe, but Perrianne was unconvinced. If he was willing to abduct her for this, what freedom of choice was there to speak of? He'd proposed she become a stand-in for his daughter. Frankly, she'd find more solace in the Duchess simply killing her outright than enduring this charade and relying on the drug's effects. This method was simply a way to repeatedly propose the idea after her memory was wiped until she willingly agreed. Of course, the drug wouldn't work on her, and she could escape, but this was an opportunity to infiltrate the duchy. So, Perrianne thanked the Duke, remarking on how much he loved his daughter. The Duke, choked with unspoken emotion, confessed that for this child, he was prepared to shoulder any necessary sin. Razor promised Perrianne any reward she desired, as long as she worked for him. The choice, he insisted, was hers. Several days later, while packing in the Rococo Holy Kingdom, Perrianne recounted her meeting with the Duke and her decision to agree. The other person expressed skepticism at her choice, but acknowledged the mission entrusted to her by Her Majesty the Queen. This interlocutor was Maman Roki, the sole heir to the Rococo Holy Kingdom. They had grown up together, closer than Perrianne had ever been to her own siblings. Maman was worried. Until now, she had always tried to avoid any contact with the Exer family, yet now she spoke of infiltrating the Duke's very household. Their relationship had been strained from the start. 14 years prior, when Perrianne first met Maman, he had opposed her staying in the kingdom. The reason being that at the time, the Rococo Holy Kingdom was surrounded by the Western and Eastern empires, its sovereignty precarious. Even at 11 years old, Maman understood that this could lead to the Eastern Empire declaring war on the kingdom. He had tried to make Perrianne understand that she was a liability to the kingdom, and if she had any shame, she should live quietly as if she were dead. The girl worried that her being alive might cause problems, as it could jeopardize the kingdom's 2,000-year-old sovereignty. Young Perrianne became so stressed that she began to lose consciousness. When she awoke, she found Her Majesty, Maman's mother, scolding her son, saying such behavior was unbefitting a future heir. After Maman apologized and left, Her Majesty turned to see Perrianne awake. She asked the queen why she had taken her in, since the boy had said she was harmful to the nation. If that were true, she reasoned she could simply be sent back to the tower. Maman confirmed that Perrianne would now have to live under an assumed identity, but her life itself wouldn't be a falsehood. She explained that some professions required one to impersonate others, and that the nation relied on such individuals for its very survival. Perrianne hoped this meant she could contribute as well, but the queen replied that she hadn't taken her in for assistance, but because she couldn't bear to see the child mistreated. It was her own choice, and Perrianne bore no responsibility for it, so she asked her to simply grow up well and not worry about anything. That would be enough. The next day, Mello apologized for his harsh words earlier, but Perrianne was more interested in knowing who these people were, the ones protecting the nation in secret. The boy figured the queen was probably referring to the intelligence division, like spies, Perrianne thought. If it was a job that required hiding one's identity and protecting the nation, then she could do it, even if it meant living under a false name. If it meant becoming an asset to the queen who had saved her, then it didn't matter. Perrianne no longer held any feelings for the Exer Duchy. Mello should understand how important it was to prevent a marriage alliance between the empires. Mello did understand, but what puzzled him was her demeanor. It was as if the Exer Duchy had nothing to do with her. It seemed she had already moved on from her past, but here she was about to encounter her family. To say she had no qualms would be nonsensical. Perrianne must have figured something out. He was certain Her Majesty had also considered this. Perhaps it would be better to let Perrianne decide this matter herself. Then Mello decided to give her an additional order. Give her another 6 months, and have her return after thoroughly ruining the Exer family's reputation. Perrianne saw how much he believed in her, not even allowing for the possibility of her failure. While it was a mistake for a wise ruler to overestimate the abilities of their subordinates, it was a different story if that subordinate was her, for Perrianne was the kingdom's finest spy. The former Duke Razor would soon discover that his cherished daughter was a fake. When he realized that the daughter he had searched for all these years was an imposter, he would never think of looking for her again. And Perrianne would make him understand that assuming she would die and not matching was his greatest misfortune. Although it was an unexpected development, this mission was quite valuable to Perrianne. A few days later, the girl was already on a train heading towards the border of the Eastern Empire, meaning she would soon arrive in the Exer Duchy. She recalled the idiot Mello, who considered himself the heir to the empire, giving her such a foolish order. But it also showed how much he trusted her, because there was nothing she couldn't handle. With her abilities, she was quite confident about this. Thanks to her earth magic, which had evolved perfectly for survival in the tower, it was ideally suited for espionage. Perrianne could go without food for days. She could derive sustenance from dirt or muddy water, and she could even create human-like dolls. The family of mud figures she had crafted out of loneliness and self-reproach wouldn't break, even if she wept. At some point, they began to show color, their limbs moving as if jointed, the rough clay transforming into a leather-like texture. Just as the Bible said God created man from clay, she too could mold humans. However, she didn't think of herself as similar to God, and the feeling of creating people with her own hands was indeed terrifying. She also discovered another ability, the reason for which was simple. She wanted to leave the tower, and to gain a sense of vicarious satisfaction, she made clay figures and sent them outside. At that moment, she realized her hearing and vision were linked to the clay figures. Later, in addition to the exchange of senses, she also learned to transfer herself into the clay bodies. This discovery was made when she fell gravely ill in the tower. After mastering these skills, the tower no longer frightened her. When sick, she would transfer herself into a simulacrum. When she wanted to see the outside world, she would send a clay figure to observe. When she felt lonely, she would stay with the silent family members made of clay. She spent 8 years in that tower. Upon Perrianne's arrival, a maid greeted her, informing her that they had been expecting her visit and had made preparations. She was relieved. It was good not to have to wait, especially as she was somewhat fatigued, though the journey hadn't been arduous. As the former Duke had promised, she was treated well, everyone being courteous during the escort. However, she felt that everyone was whispering behind her back because, thanks to the artifact, she looked almost identical. Everyone was gossiping, as if she couldn't hear them. But from the moment she boarded the train, she could hear everything through the clay figures scattered about, and see everything happening outside the compartment, though there was nothing to be done about it. Only a few knew about the stand-in. To the others, she was just a servant who resembled the Duke's daughter. The girl led Perrianne to the ladies' receiving room, saying that the madam would summon her shortly. The girl was Lucian Isselberg, the second daughter of the prominent Isselberg family, designated as the Duke's daughter's handmaid for birth. Perrianne thought, if she had continued to grow up in the duchy, Lucian would have been her friend, but now it seemed she was serving a false Duke's daughter. Lucian reported that the madam was currently with Lord Larian and asked her to be more mindful of her behavior in his presence. Larian Exer was Perrianne's brother. She had expected to see him upon arriving at the mansion, but him sharing a room with his sister at such a late hour was unusual. The Exer family was a prominent family that placed great importance on etiquette, and even between siblings, titles and decorum were to be observed. Being in the room together at this hour was strange. And from the way Lucian spoke, it seemed they often shared a room at this time. Well, were they really just the two of them? Perrianne decided to stop thinking about such useless things. She needed to prepare herself mentally before meeting the imposter. During the 4 years the Duchess searched for her daughter, many young noblewomen came to the Duke's castle, dreaming of instantly gaining the title of Duchess. But deceiving the Duchess's family members wasn't easy, and those cunning individuals, once discovered as fakes, were often driven out. However, this imposter had already endured a year of scrutiny without her origins being exposed. This wasn't something a clever individual could accomplish alone. It was highly likely an organization was behind the deception of the Duke's family. Clearly, the girl impersonating the Duke's daughter was no ordinary person. When the Duke's false daughter entered the reception room, Perrianne was taken aback by her composure and the casual greeting. The girl was sweet and amiable, completely different from what Perrianne had imagined. She explained that she had grown up outside the family and might be somewhat lacking in etiquette, asking for understanding. Behind the imposter stood a man whom she introduced as her brother, Larian Exer, adding that he cared for her deeply. Perrianne was bewildered. Even if he did care deeply for her, was it appropriate for a grown man to dry the hair of a girl clad only in a bathrobe? Princesses were typically attended to by handmaids, yet they were all conspicuously absent, leaving the two alone. Perrianne concluded that their relationship seemed more like that of lovers. As siblings, their dynamic was strange. The brother didn't even recognize his own sister standing before him. She had never imagined her longed-for reunion with her brother would be like this. But if even her father couldn't recognize his own daughter, what more could be said? The young lady asked her name. Upon hearing Perrianne's reply, she remarked on the strange similarity between their names. This became the perfect excuse to suggest Perrianne change her name, which took her by surprise. Because of her brown hair, the young lady gave her the most obvious name, Brown. Perrianne had a feeling adapting to this role wouldn't be easy. Brown began to speak about her mission, but the princess interrupted, saying it wasn't necessary and she could leave. Brown wondered if Perrianne knew she was her emergency stand-in, but the young lady knew everything, simply repeating that it wasn't necessary, as she wouldn't easily get into trouble. Even if something did happen, with so many talented knights and her brothers around, what use would Brown be? Perrianne knew her father worried about her, but using magical items wasn't necessary. Brown, however, doubted he would give up so easily. The princess smiled sweetly, saying they had nothing more to discuss, and Brown could leave the reception room. Perrianne thought that even if the handmaid was her shadow double, they were too alike. The reason she could impersonate the Duke's daughter was because of their similar appearance, soft brown hair and violet eyes that sparkled like jewels. But what a price she had paid to become Perrianne. Now another girl who looked like the Duke's daughter had appeared. What if she lost her position because of her? Perrianne asked her brother if the girl looked a lot like her. He agreed, wondering where their father had found her. He tried to comfort her, explaining that the girl was brought in as her stand-in, and there was no need to be so upset. But if it bothered her, he could ensure the girl wouldn't come near her again. Perrianne simply said it wasn't necessary. She had considered scarring her face, but then her value as a stand-in would disappear, and her father was deeply worried about that. Still, her brother's words made her feel a little better. Larian scoffed at Perrianne's worries over such trivial matters, reiterating that Brown was merely an imposter. But then he asked if Perrianne could still use her earth-manipulating magic like she did when they were children. Perrianne tried to explain that after the trauma she'd endured, she couldn't use her magic anymore. How could he even ask such a question? He apologized, of course, but Perrianne couldn't understand why he'd bring up an ability she couldn't possibly imitate. She didn't know it, but even without that ability, she was still Duke Exer's daughter. No one would suspect anything. Even Larian was apologizing now, just to appease her. Everything would be all right. Brown entered her room and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted. She couldn't understand how she'd gotten the nickname Brown simply because of her brown hair. She'd also been ordered not to work, something she'd half expected. The Duchess's declaration that she needn't work wasn't out of concern, but a way to ostracize her. The Duchess's childish behavior in front of Larian was a deliberate display of dominance. Just because they looked alike, Brown had become the Duke's daughter. The Duchess must be insecure because a maid who resembled her had appeared. At first, Brown had been confused by Perrianne's seemingly kind demeanor, but as expected, she wasn't easy to get along with. It didn't matter if she gave orders or not. With Brown's abilities, there was no information she couldn't obtain. The ground might look like ordinary dirt, but no one in the world could live without touching it. The dust between window panes, the mud clinging to shoes, the soil in flower pots. Wherever people lived, there was soil, and she could influence it all. The order not to work would actually give Brown more time to carry out her mission. The Duchess couldn't restrain or hinder her. After all, she had survived that harsh tower. The Saintly Kingdom's most formidable spy was ready. A man approached the tower where young Perrianne had been exiled. He regarded it as a wicked tower, just like the imposter posing as the Duke's daughter. The man recalled that a year had passed since this imposter had appeared in the Exeter Duchy. Perhaps the atmosphere in the duchy had recently become more harmonious because of the long-lost daughter. But in truth, all the members of the Exer family had become peculiar at some point. Rixo Exer, possessor of unparalleled strength, had immediately left the duchy to live in seclusion after his daughter called him frightening. Larian Exer, the Elder of Dreams, known for his authority and adherence to rules, had begun to disregard rules and common sense, simply to indulge his sister's whims. Phoenix Exer, the noble and distinguished second son, a knight, had started drinking after his sister's appearance, something he'd never touched before. He'd become unable to control himself, his behavior erratic. The man couldn't believe that everything had happened after Perrianne's return. This was no joke. The Duke's real daughter had died long ago. The man before him was named Perrianne Exer, the first adopted son in the duchy's history and the current duke. In a duchy where bloodline held such significance, he had been taken in by the duchess and inherited the title. The man was known for his arrogance and volatile temper, traits that overshadowed all his accomplishments and abilities. He wasn't particularly alarmed by the return of the duke's daughter. He had, after all, managed affairs admirably in the absence of a legitimate heir. Even so, there was the matter of the duke's daughter. When introduced to Perrianne, she had been delighted at the prospect of forming a connection with him. He, however, had retorted that Lady Perrianne looked repulsive. This, naturally, displeased the young woman greatly, and from that moment on, the atmosphere within the duchy had become strained. Larian, Perrianne's brother, who listened intently to his sister's every word, and the duke, who loathed the lady, began their confrontation. Others might have considered this treatment cruel, but when faced with an imposter, he had no other choice. For Lady Perrianne was someone very special to him. Throughout the Eastern Empire, everyone knew he had been adopted by the Exer family and become the duke, but few knew the reason behind his adoption. In truth, he had been adopted because a husband was needed for Lady Perrianne. The Exer family, yearning for the return of their exiled daughter, discovered the only way to bring the unrelated Perrianne back was to have her marry an adopted son, returning to the duchy as a daughter-in-law. He had been one of Perrianne's prospective puppet husbands, worn down by the constant competition and pressure, so his journey to the tower that day was born of a restless heart. He simply wanted to confirm whether the Duke of Exer's daughter, the one everyone yearned for, was the only one who could deliver him from this hell. If she chose him, he could escape all the suffering, and he believed all his efforts would finally bear fruit. Yet, before his eyes, Perrianne's bloodstains, though over a decade old, still appeared fresh. Everything within the tower felt malevolent, from the air itself to the bricks beneath his feet. In such a dreadful place, Lady Perrianne had truly lived, hidden from view. The scratch marks left by fingernails were the marks of a child. She must have wept there. If only he could have done something for her. No, perhaps it was better that she was dead. If she had returned to that strange family, she would never have known happiness. He understood perfectly well that, with her demise, any proposal was meaningless. He couldn't save her then, and in the end, he became a puppet without a master. So there was no reason to visit the tower again. It was all futile. Just like the Exer family, unable to accept the truth, he too clung to a girl who was no longer among the living. If Perrianne were still alive, everything would be so much better. 2 weeks had passed since Brown became the Duke's false daughter, and she was slowly adapting to life as a servant. Because the lady had initially rejected her, everyone treated her as if she were invisible. But a spy must adapt to any environment, so she carefully insinuated that her assignment as a servant here was a mistake. Because she didn't refuse menial tasks and even showed initiative, at some point everyone opened up to her. Even if it was a ploy, hard work had its merits. She might even receive some tasty treats. 3 men, catching sight of Brown, began to gossip. One remarked on the Duchess's apparent neglect of the girl, how no one seemed to care for her. Another, emboldened by this observation, voiced his intention to drag her off to his bedroom. A nearby maid, overhearing their crass conversation, felt a wave of disgust wash over her. The knight, abruptly changing his demeanor, rushed to assist the maid with her heavy water buckets, insisting on accompanying her to the refuse area. He inquired about her life in the Duke's castle, suggesting that the transition from the saintly kingdom must have been difficult, and proposed they share a drink and conversation. Brown thanked him for the offer, but explained that her position made casual drinking with anyone difficult. The knight, his earlier pretense of chivalry gone, retorted angrily that even if she was a favored servant, it didn't make her a noble lady. He had been kind, he argued, and she could address him however she pleased. But Brown was already thinking about how quickly his true colors had shown. His friends began to jeer, mocking him for being rejected by a servant girl who seemed to have high standards. Perry was Brown's designated maid, and Brown knew people looked down on her when they saw her performing menial tasks. But regardless of appearances, a personal maid played a different role. The position was distinct from a common servant, its status no less than that of a low-ranking noble. The offended knight, declaring that courage stemmed from ignorance, decided to put her in her place with a blow. Unexpectedly, Sir Phoenix appeared behind Brown, intercepting the attack. Brown had sensed his presence the moment he stepped behind her. Furthermore, his ability to mask the heavy scent of alcohol suggested the rumors of his superhuman abilities were not unfounded. He let the night go. Judging by his voice, he seemed sober, meaning he wasn't truly drunk. Their encounter in such a place was unexpected. Brown thanked him, puzzled by his silence as he simply stared at her. Finally, he remarked that she looked like his sister. It was clear he had been mistaking her for the returned Perrianne. She'd heard often enough, but still asked if he needed anything from her. Phoenix denied it, telling her to continue her work. Brown had heard that Phoenix had started drinking more heavily since Perrianne's return, but she hadn't expected it to be this bad. Still, it wasn't her concern. That day marked their first meeting in 20 years, and he had stared at her with the eyes of someone looking at another person entirely until she left. Afterward, she assumed she wouldn't encounter him again. Contrary to her expectations, however, Phoenix began to shadow her every day. The first day, she dismissed it as coincidence, but Phoenix's persistent and suspicious loitering nearby, sometimes leaving and then returning, couldn't be a coincidence. It wasn't the first time, and it was starting to irritate her. Brown decided she had to say something to him today. Others might not have noticed, but she had her reasons for being particularly suspicious of Phoenix. Up until now, the girl had been occupied with her duties as a servant, but that didn't mean she had neglected her mission and surveillance of the castle. Her ability to both observe and carry out her daily activities was thanks to her skills in gathering information and infiltrating as a mud person. First, the mud people could relay what they saw and heard, allowing Brown to monitor different areas of the castle. Two maids discussed how clever Brown was, how willing she was to help and work, and expressed pity for her initial struggles. By remembering key details, they could pass information on to her, though sometimes they witnessed killings or even displayed mating ants. Despite this, they had many useful functions. However, earth magic also had its limitations. Those with developed senses like Sir Phoenix could easily detect it, and in the presence of superhuman abilities, these powers were significantly impaired. Although she had already figured out the castle's defensive magic and the Knight's patrol routes by sending out the mud people, if Phoenix followed her, her abilities would be restricted. Brown spread a blanket on the lawn and invited the Duke's son, Larian, to sit and talk with her. She asked him if he was following her because she resembled his sister, Lady Perrianne, and if so, wouldn't it be easier to just go see his sister directly? What was the problem with a brother seeing his sister? But Phoenix replied that he couldn't go, and if he had a conscience, he shouldn't see her. After that, Phoenix didn't speak anymore, and eventually, their conversation ended. While walking through the castle, someone called out to Brown, and she felt confused. Someone in the duchy was actually welcoming her warmly. The girl who found Brown exclaimed how much she resembled the Duke's daughter, like an angel. It was Elberry, a strong-willed individual who, with her swordsmanship skills, had earned a position as an attendant to the princess and served as an administrative assistant in the Eastern Empire, where only noble women could become maids. Because the selection criteria for maids were different, they usually came from noble families within the country, like Lucian. Sometimes there were exceptions, where only ability was considered, and Elberry was such an exception. Brown asked her who she was, and Elberry said she could call her by her name, as the maids were of equal standing and complimented Brown's beautiful skin. She would be quite boisterous. Elberry, having heard that the girl hadn't been assigned any work yet, suggested they spend some time together. She would be happy if they could become friends. Brown was surprised, as she had assumed Elberry would hate her, since she was also an attendant to the princess. But in the end, she agreed to play along. It was a good opportunity to learn more about her plans. Elberry invited her into the office, and Brown found her to be a more simple-minded girl than expected. She began to wonder if Elberry was being so kind to her because she resembled the Duke's daughter. She was so fond of the princess. It was strange that no one else had noticed this. However, this made Elberry's behavior all the more suspicious. According to the information she had obtained, Elberry had been demoted because of Perrianne, so it was difficult for her to win the Duke's daughter's favor. After meeting with Elberry and spending some time with her, she noticed some strange signs. Unfortunately, there was no indication that she was hiding anything. It seemed she truly was being friendly because she liked the Duke's daughter, but perhaps she shouldn't overthink it. In any case, Brown would be leaving the duchy soon. She just needed to avoid interfering. Perhaps with Elberry's help, she could gain new information. Elberry asked if working in such a large-scale brewery was hard, and Brown replied that it wasn't because she was strong. Despite all this, she attended night classes at the academy, much to the delight of her new friends. Brown's role was mostly fabricated, but this part was real. She wasn't carrying out a mission at the academy, but genuinely studying. She always needed to live with someone else's personality and face. But none of the personalities she'd used before had anything to do with Perrianne Mello. Her Majesty must have felt sorry for her, so she allowed her to use her own name, Perry, at the academy. Thanks to this, the former Duke Exer had discovered her, allowing her to enter the castle calmly. In this situation, Elberry suggested learning swordsmanship from Sir Phoenix, as the opportunity to learn from him was a great thing in itself. Brown refused, explaining that Phoenix was a burden to her. Just then, he appeared at their table. Phoenix later justified himself, saying he came to give Elberry something, not to follow her. Of course, the incident in the dining hall was her fault, but once he heard that, he could have stopped following her out of self-respect. However, because the boy followed her even more openly than before, this situation happened every time. It wasn't her fault, but seeing people frightened made her ashamed, so she had no choice but to make a decision. She decided to bear the burden named Phoenix alone and requested to work in a secluded place. However, she began to feel at peace as she didn't have to hear people screaming. Phoenix said that Perrianne looked like a small pillow from behind when she sat, cute enough to want to steal her away, and Brown had to listen to this nonsense. He continued to tell stories, and Brown, exasperated by how many bottles of alcohol he'd already consumed, asked him to at least have some snacks. From a certain day onwards, Phoenix started talking about Perrianne, all with the same content, about how sweet and kind little Perrianne was. He recounted how Perry sometimes shared candy with him, even taking it from her own mouth to give to him. Brown found it strange. He remembered so many things from her childhood, but even if he did, it didn't matter now. The girl collapsed on her bed, exhausted, and began to think. Despite her diminished strength, she roughly understood the situation in the duchy. She had to find a way to expose the imposter. In fact, the easiest way would be to demonstrate her territory management skills, but that absolutely could not happen. She wouldn't be let go so easily afterward. Moreover, she not only had to worry about the Duke's fake daughter, but also about the secret forces helping this imposter being exposed. The Duke's daughter was in her room now. Perhaps the natives would check her room and find something. She wasn't in her room. Perhaps she was in the bathroom, where there were also several natives. They needed to look around and see what she was doing. Brown wondered why she was touching her eyes with her bare hands while they were bleeding. The pain the princess felt while applying the contents of the jar must be an indispensable part of impersonating the Duke's daughter. It was probably used to change her eye color. Purple was a good sign. It was genetically difficult to acquire. With one exception, the good sign was a matrilineal trait, only appearing when women accomplished in magic or swordsmanship gave birth to daughters. As expected, Perrianne's most striking features were her eye and hair color, so that ointment could be used for other purposes. If you can prove your daughter's eye color is fake, Elberry reasoned, then everyone will understand she's an imposter. And with any luck, Brown might discover who's supplying the Duke's false daughter with the ointment, killing two birds with one stone. The plan was well devised, but Elberry had forgotten Brown's burden. Larian, recounting stories of his sister, confided in her that he was the first to know Perrianne had a fondness for bitter flavors. Brown couldn't help but ask, if he missed his sister so much and spoke of her daily, why didn't he go see her? How could his father and brother be so repulsive, abandoning her, and now pretending they couldn't live without her? They had cast aside such a lovely child. Come to think of it, Sir Phoenix had only ever told Brown about Perrianne before she was sent away. He never boasted about his grown-up sister after her return, despite her being a noble woman admired and loved throughout the continent. It was unlikely he knew she was a fake. If he did, he would have punished her immediately. Sir Phoenix was likely still living in the past, in the memory of a happy family. He was trying to live normally, but cognitive dissonance had set in when Perrianne returned. If, in this state, he discovered she wasn't real, Sir Phoenix would go mad and try to harm the imposter. He finally asked Brown her name, finding it odd who would give her such a name. Still, now that he'd asked her name, perhaps he would stop treating her like a substitute. If only he would stop following her. Brown decided the conversation was over and turned to leave, but Sir Phoenix called out to her. He asked if she, in Perrianne's position, could live and eat peacefully knowing her family had abandoned her. Brown had no clear answer, but just as she was about to say something, they were interrupted by Helek, the commander of the Sapphire Knights, the largest knight order in the Eastern Empire. Sir Phoenix asked him what the matter was, and Helek replied that Salarian had invited them both to dinner. Arriving at dinner, Larian expressed his pleasure that Miss Brown had accepted his sudden invitation. He explained he'd invited her today to thank her for enduring the nuisance caused by his rogue younger brother. Larian Exer, who had completely ignored her the first day, suddenly invited her to dinner. What was he planning? And without inviting his sister, just the two of them, was it really just a thank you because of Sir Phoenix? The brothers were more amicable than she had imagined. Usually, noble families didn't get along due to differing opinions. She had recently remarked on how repulsive the brothers were, assuming they had a poor relationship, but they were family after all. Meanwhile, during her own meal, the princess learned that her brother was having dinner with Sir Phoenix and Miss Brown. Perrianne was incredulous. Why would they go to dinner without her? But then again, her brother, Sir Phoenix, had been following that girl around lately. Yes, he'd started drinking less, but it wasn't enough for either of them. Lucian began to worry about the lady, but she smiled sweetly and said everything was fine, that she needed to finish her meal quickly. But then she turned away and abruptly started repeating Brown's name, her face so similar to Brown's. She was drawing the brothers to her side. Brown had no idea where she stood, but the princess wouldn't let her go regardless. For now, though, Perrianne, the imposter, decided she needed to calm down and focus on her plan. There were more important things to do than worry about Brown. She asked Lucian how the engagement arrangements were progressing. He replied that Lord Haimtane had reacted favorably, so Haimtane Windham would be arriving at the Duke's estate soon. Who would have thought the marriage talks would actually succeed? The Exer and Windham families were prominent houses representing their respective nations. Lord Hoddington was set to inherit the Windham family. However, 6 years ago, relations between the two families had soured and war had seemed imminent. A single marriage certainly couldn't forge an alliance on its own. Thanks to the Exer family effectively abandoning their daughter, Perrianne, the imposter, could accomplish this more easily than it appeared. She was playing the role of the Duke's daughter perfectly. Marrying Aunter would bring her such a reward, a comfortable life as the Duchess of Windham. She would be universally blessed and respected for the rest of her life. In that case, she needed to get rid of Brown so that the Lord wouldn't encounter her when he arrived and get any unnecessary ideas when he saw her. The only question was how to get rid of her. Suddenly, Perrianne's the imposter eyes began to ache intensely. It was a side effect of the ointment, a sensation like fingernails scraping against her eyeballs. Why did she have to suffer so much? It was all because of Brown. Ever since she'd arrived, nothing had gone as smoothly as it should have. How dare she walk around with a face so similar to hers? Her master couldn't let her get away with this. She had to crush the wretch, make her unrecognizable. Phoenix remarked that it was the first time he'd seen his brother treat a servant this way, calling her Miss Larion. Larian retorted that she wasn't just any servant, revealing that his father had chosen her as Perrianne's personal maid. Judging by Phoenix's reaction, he'd been completely unaware of this. He was the most righteous of knights. If he'd known beforehand, he surely would have objected. That's why they hadn't told him. Phoenix realized with a start. That's why Brown was doing servant's work. Perrianne, the imposter, disliked people like her, so she kept her at a distance. Larian had to step in. The problem was he spoiled Perrianne, the imposter, too much. Larian apologized, saying he would definitely let him know when the former Duke arrived. Brown felt awkward. Last time, he'd treated her like air, and now he was feigning friendliness. Larian also noticed that Phoenix was at ease around Miss Brown, but silent as a stone in front of Perrianne, the imposter. Phoenix didn't deny it. He clung to this person who resembled his sister, sharing memories, but he was still afraid to stand before Perrianne, the imposter. Now, remembering the good times, he was starting to show concern. It was like trying to erase the painful past of that child. Felix's brothers supported him, promising that time would make things better. For now, all they could do was love her until the very end. Someday, Brown found it strangely amusing. They had completely forgotten her presence as they reminisced about their sister, their real sister, who sat right there with them. It was, ironically, the first dinner they had shared together. But she would be leaving this place soon. Perhaps this was their last supper. Brown left the room with a sigh of relief, the awkwardness and strange atmosphere clinging to her like a shroud. More pressing matters demanded her attention. Her operative had successfully procured the ointment from Perrianne, the real Perrianne, the Duke's daughter. Now, the time for testing had come. In the bathroom, a small jar held the crimson salve. She had instructed her earth mage to retrieve a sample while everyone was at dinner. The girl, accompanied by her diminutive mage, held the ointment, cautiously inhaling its aroma. She hoped she was wrong, but the scent was unmistakable. Monster. The ointment was a monster byproduct, crafted from its flesh or blood. The price of the potent power it granted was a brutalizing side effect. This method of processing was notorious for its unethical nature. Acquiring such a substance would be impossible for her alone. Whoever was behind this was no ordinary person. Why would Perrianne use such a thing? The potent side effects of monster byproducts were well documented, but this needed verification. Meanwhile, Perrianne, through a communication port, summoned all the maids and ordered Brown brought before her. Brown was taken aback by the sudden summons. From an inability to tolerate pain to impulsive decisions, she suspected the side effects were already manifesting. The maids, following their instructions, dragged her into Perrianne's room and threw her to the floor. Brown began to inquire why she had been summoned, if she had committed some offense, when Perrianne suddenly lashed out, striking her across the face. Such a sudden, public display of violence in front of the other maids. Wasn't this another side effect? The lines between right and wrong were blurring. Perrianne threw a stack of documents at Brown, accusing her of trying to supplant her, capitalizing on their similar appearance. Brown found this almost comical. The documents detailed her personal information. It seemed Perrianne had been investigating her. Perrianne's investigation had been thorough. She had discovered Brown was an orphan, with no family, friends, or employment, possessing only a single academy diploma, and nearly expelled for violence. She shrieked that ever since Brown's arrival, the ducal estate had been in chaos, disrupted by her reckless behavior. Brown recognized Perrianne's irrationality, but chose to feign apology. Perrianne conceded her own fault as the mistress of the house for neglecting Brown, and, therefore, commanded her to appear before her every day from now on. She would take personal responsibility for Brown's discipline, all for her own good. Brown should be grateful. They would be seeing each other quite often. Brown left the room, exhaling a deep sigh. Just as she had planned, the mission was proceeding smoothly. A sudden gust of wind, seemingly from nowhere, ruffled her hair. All of Perrianne's theatrics were meaningless. She had even gone so far as to summon everyone to publicly humiliate Brown. Only Elberry's expression remained unchanged. After the princess's public humiliation of Brown, she was contemplating whether their friendship was still worth maintaining. Of course, she had always favored the Duke's daughter over Brown from the beginning. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When the door opened, Elberry jumped out from behind it and embraced Brown. Brown was surprised, as she had assumed they could no longer be close, especially with Lucien also present. Even knowing how Perrianne had treated her, they still came to her. Lucien announced that everything was prepared, and Brown thanked her, asking if it was all right for them to visit her like this. After everything that had happened, her friends told her that, truthfully, Perrianne became incredibly irritable every month, to the point where everyone suspected it was a form of delirium. Once a month, the side effects of the ointment would intensify. The cycle of its use was precisely 1 month. Lucien continued, explaining that the princess was usually a kind person, but this must be repressed resentment being released in such a manner. Brown disagreed internally. Perhaps Perrianne was simply skilled at maintaining a facade. This wasn't a result of childhood trauma, but a side effect of the ointment. Suddenly, Lucian began to apologize, saying that as the head maid, she couldn't tell Perrianne she was in the wrong. She understood her apology wouldn't fix anything, but she pleaded for Brown's understanding. Even witnessing Perrianne's cruelty, Lucian still bowed to Brown, a girl of low birth. Elberry, too, was worried for Brown, but couldn't speak up in front of the Duke's daughter. Brown could feel how loved and cherished Perrianne was by those around her, a life she herself had once dreamed of. If she could return as the Duke's daughter again, loved by all, it would be a wonderful scenario. But those hopes were now in the past. Now, even without remorse from those who had wronged her, she simply lived with a quiet smile, cherishing her time with those close to her. So, looking at the Duke's daughter, she felt no regret. She was simply committed to her mission, and she didn't condemn anyone's personal desires. However, the use of monster byproducts was an entirely different matter. Because the use of monster byproducts was a terrible crime. It exploited the human body. 700 years ago, monsters appeared in the human world, and people fought them for a long time, successfully protecting their homes. However, the sense of victory was short-lived. People began using monster skin, flesh, and blood, and had to deal with a large amount of residual byproducts. One day, after a series of processing failures due to the unusual hardness of monster byproducts, a blacksmith succeeded in crafting weapons from them. But this processing method had a fatal flaw: the idea of using human bones as a material. The processing method and results varied for each monster, and when it came to killing for this purpose, the Empire classified recycling as the most serious crime. Apparently, Perrianne not only wanted Brown's eyes, but also wanted her body to resemble Brown's. In addition to the ointment, she had used various monster products. They needed to find a mastermind behind this quickly, otherwise, something terrible might happen. Perhaps Brown should also engage in some scheming, because just as she was immune to the drug, she also had the ability to neutralize the side effects of monster products. Her Majesty, the Queen, and Mello couldn't figure out how it worked, but it was a useful advantage. Her blood had the peculiar property of both accelerating and blocking the byproduct's effects. Mixed with the ointment, it would cause Perrianne to lose control the next time she used it. According to Lucian, the next application was due in a month, precisely when Duke Pandanian and Perrianne's fiancée, Hanten, were scheduled to arrive at the ducal estate. It was a perfect setup. Perrianne could force Brown's exposure in front of everyone. A month passed, filled with anticipation for the Duke and Lord Hanten's arrival. The maids chattered excitedly, convinced the princess's marriage would benefit them all. Now, with Van Dam also arriving to discuss the marriage arrangements, the castle buzzed with the servants' thrilled whispers. It should have been a joyous occasion, but Brown knew the truth about the Duke's daughter. The celebratory atmosphere sickened her. Juris approached, asking Brown to help her recover. "Milady seems completely out of control," she confided. Brown had been there for a full month now. The situation was deteriorating. "It's clear those gentlemen are in immense pain," Brown replied, "so I must endure." But Juris, exasperated, retorted, "You're madder than the Duke's daughter." She couldn't understand why Perrianne watched Brown so closely. Had Brown started to develop the same devoted affection for her mistress as the Eastern Empire's people? Juris, a mage from the Western Empire, couldn't comprehend such reverence. Despite Perrianne's orders, Juris had secretly cared for Brown for a month, and now her animosity towards Brown had intensified. Brown deliberately didn't resist, careful not to disrupt her mission, but she felt deeply embarrassed by the concern so many showed her. Juris reminded Brown that the former Duke, Rasso, would also return soon for negotiations, and then Brown could discuss leaving her service. Despite her gruff manner, Juris was kind. "I'm doing this because Elberry is worried," she admitted, "and by disobeying the princess's orders to prolong your suffering, I've completely healed you." Even though Brown was back in her family's home, the only ones who worried about her were her friends, not her family. Even seeing her, they ignored the evidence of her mistreatment. Even without knowing what happened in Perrianne's chambers, there was jealousy that the lady summoned Brown daily. As for the former Duke, he hadn't emerged from the tower since his daughter claimed he frightened her. The current Duke, because of Perrianne, had returned to the castle. He'd been forced to negotiate with the Western Empire and stay at Hanten's castle. But if he waited a little longer, he could eliminate the imposter. He saw a brown-haired girl and, mistaking her for Perrianne, flew into a rage. How dare she come here without permission? Such impudence. Did she even know where she was? But looking closer, he realized his mistake. It wasn't the imposter. Brown was terrified. Still, she asked if he was Duke Exer. Perhaps he had something to tell her. The Duke admitted he'd confused her with someone else, with the Duke's daughter. But she'd heard he was the only one in the Exer family who disliked her. Who would have thought he'd be so aggressive upon their first meeting? The Duke looked at her and replied, if there's nothing else, she could leave. That girl, the Perrianne imposter, looked the part of a Duke's daughter, but Brown knew Rasso must have brought her in to shield his real daughter from some threat. This fake Perrianne dismissed the maids, openly ignored her, and seemed to find new ways to offend Brown daily. Once he dealt with the false Perrianne, the girl would vanish, and he shouldn't have cared. But a strange feeling lingered. According to the schedule, Duke Pandanian should still be in the Western Empire. Why had he returned? Though the Exer family always did as they pleased. Truthfully, she had no reason to avoid Pandanian. It was just uncomfortable, seeing his face, remembering the past. As a child, she'd felt inferior in his presence, perhaps because of those diamond-like eyes of his. There had always been legends, tales of eyes like gems that could ward off evil and see the truth. She dismissed it as a children's story to some extent. Yet, those rumors gained traction when Rasso announced the adoption. The future of the Exer family and the Eastern Empire required diamond eyes. If she had possessed such precious eyes, perhaps she wouldn't have been cast aside as a bastard. Fresh from her escape from the tower, still reeling from the ordeal, hearing such talk had plunged her into a deep well of self-doubt. It had been a difficult time for Mello, struggling to unearth the truth. Now that inferiority was gone, the stories about Diamond Eyes were just that, stories. They offered no benefit beyond keen eyesight. Still, everyone believed Pandanian could see the truth with his eyes, thanks to his accomplishments. In an age where long voyages were nearly impossible, the seas teeming with ferocious monsters, he was the first to discover a new continent. A genius who overcame his family's prejudice with countless achievements, proving his capabilities. That was the current Duke Pandanian Exer. He hadn't discovered the new continent with his eyes, but with his abilities. Yet, it was enough to create the illusion. Brown, envious that the Holy Kingdom lacked such talent, had to acknowledge his prowess. But it was strange. Such a capable and arrogant man, personally visiting the Western Empire, with whom diplomatic relations were severed, to facilitate a marriage proposal. Of course, the people of the Eastern Empire praised the Duke's daughter, claiming her beauty brought peace to the two continents. But these two, leaders of the Eastern and Western Empires, couldn't possibly be swayed by something as superficial as beauty. Therefore, Brown believed the talk of marriage was a mere pretext. There was likely a secret plot between them, something that warranted further investigation. 3 individuals discussed Duke X's lineage and the fact that he had returned to the castle alone. One approached Lord Honten, urging him not to be upset. He assured the other that all was well, requesting that they attend to the schedule and ensure everything proceeded as planned. These marriage negotiations were merely business, concerning vast interests. Such matters wouldn't bother the Lord. Besides, she was in the Duke's castle. Honten believed it unlikely he would see her again. The Duke's daughter's maid, he wondered why she had chosen that position. Though she was difficult at first, Brown mused, if Duke Pandanian sees her after his return, he's bound to sense her abilities. I wonder how he'll react. Still, this is just a bit of entertainment. It won't affect the future that's already been set in motion. Everything would proceed according to plan, because he would be directly involved. To figure out what those two were plotting, Brown needed to tail Pandanian, but she was wary of his sharp, diamond-like eyes. However, she had recently placed a small earthen figurine nearby, allowing her to observe from a distance without being detected. She'd created it just in case. She saw the Duke sitting across from a man. It was Larian, whose hobby seemed to be wandering into his siblings' rooms at night. I need to hear what they're talking about, she thought. She'd heard there was friction between them because of their sister, but their relationship wasn't as bad as she'd imagined. The Duke interrupted his brother, asking how long he intended to keep up this charade. Brown was shocked by what she heard. From the context, the charade they were referring to could only be the Duke's daughter. So these two knew the truth, but how they knew remained a mystery. But at that moment, the connection was severed. Brown thought with frustration, if only I'd made a few more figurines, or even a normal-sized one. From what she'd overheard, Larian, despite knowing the princess was an imposter, still treated his sister kindly. But why? If these two knew she was a fake, then everyone, from Hanten to the former Duke Rasso, should know Perrianne's true identity. That couldn't be. First, judging by Hanten's behavior, it was highly unlikely he knew the truth. He felt incredibly guilty towards her, tormented by it. And if former Duke Rasso knew she wasn't the real Perrianne, he wouldn't have kidnapped Brown and threatened to bring her here. The possibility was low. Judging by his expression when he suggested the medicine that day, neither Hanten nor Rasso knew she was an imposter. But why hadn't anyone told them? Especially with something as important as the marriage negotiations underway. Even knowing the truth about the Duke's daughter, they were still pushing forward with the marriage negotiations. If Pandanian was turning a blind eye to something so dangerous, then perhaps Hanten and Pandanian also knew this Perrianne was a fake. She had considered the possibility that the marriage was just a pretext, but this was the worst-case scenario. If the two leaders reached an agreement without considering anyone else's opinion, if this wasn't hostility but collusion, then the probability of disaster for the Holy Kingdom exceeded 5,000%. First, the plan to expose the fake had completely failed, but as far as Brown knew, no one yet knew the princess was using monster byproducts. No matter how hard Hanten and Pandanian tried, she wouldn't escape punishment for using the byproducts. They thought everything would go their way, but now that Brown was involved, she would make things difficult for both of them. Meanwhile, Pandanian rebuked his brother for not telling Hanten and Rasso about all of this. Larian replied that it wasn't easy to start such a conversation, and Hanten wouldn't be able to accept a fake. Her sister and father had every right to savor the reunion with their daughter a little longer, but the Duke disagreed. If Larian truly cared for them, he would have revealed the whole truth already. Perhaps he simply enjoyed playing the role of doting brother to that insufferable girl for a while longer. Larian didn't really care. He would never see his deceased sister again anyway. But he wanted to experience what it would be like if she were still alive. The Duke thought he was mad, but it was thanks to his ability to persuade the imposter that the marriage negotiations were proceeding smoothly. The charade continued because of the promise of marriage between the two parties, especially since this meeting had been arranged at the insistence of a young noblewoman who knew little of aristocratic affairs. So, with just a little more patience, the vile imposter would disappear from sight. It was almost over. The princess, Perrianne, learned of the Duke's return, but as she prepared herself, she discovered that the ointment she had applied 2 days prior had lost its efficacy. Could have spoiled. She attempted to reapply it, but the pain was unbearable. On the second attempt, everything went smoothly, but why had the ointment suddenly stopped working properly? She had only been warned that with frequent use, it would become more difficult to control her emotions. Why now, when representatives from both empires were gathered, did everything seem to torment her? Her thoughts were interrupted by Larian, who had come to fetch her. She hurried towards him, for she had been waiting, but he stood silently, though usually at such times he would soothe her with gentle words. Confused, she wondered why he looked at her with such a dreadful gaze, whether she had done something wrong. He simply said that the third order was to stop. Perrianne feigned ignorance, though she suspected Pandanian was trying to sabotage her relationship with her brother. Larian continued, saying that the third one said to stop profiting or something like that she should stop clinging to him. She knew herself that if the Duke gave the order, he was powerless, so it had to be said, no matter how amusing it had been. The princess hesitated. He was acting unlike himself. Surely he wouldn't expose her. With a sneer, he begged her not to cry, for tears on such a face would break his heart. Perrianne pushed him away, claiming a foul mood, but her brother continued his taunts. The person she wanted to see was coming today, so how could she be like this? But since when had things gone wrong? Larian ordered her to prepare quickly and left. Brown noticed her brother's sudden coldness towards the princess. Or was it merely a performance for the benefit of those present? The young woman, consumed by rage, began to blame Brown for everything. She ordered everyone but Brown to leave. Brown realized the princess had lost control of her emotions again. Perrianne smashed everything around her, screaming at the maids who continued to play their roles, and they obediently apologized. She shrieked that everything had gone wrong since her arrival. At least she knew how important today was. Brown realized that, seemingly due to the effects of the ointment, she was delirious, which was only natural, as she had begun using it more frequently. Perrianne, The imposter princess muttered to herself, saying she now understood everything that it could be done. She walked to her vanity and picked up a dagger, convinced that if Brown were gone, everything would be all right. The young woman was completely out of her mind due to the ointment side effects. If this continued, she would stab someone with that dagger. Perrianne approached Brown, saying that if only she disappeared, everything would be fine. She raised her hand, ready to strike. Just then, Duke Pandanian burst into the room, shoving Perrianne away. Brown was startled, unsure why he was there. Larian appeared in the doorway, asking his brother what he was doing in Perrianne's room. He noticed Brown was injured and that Perrianne was lying on the floor, the dagger dropped beside her hand. He couldn't even imagine his precious sister would do such a thing to another person. Brown didn't know why the two men were there, but it was better this way. The Duke admitted he had anticipated this possibility. He couldn't ignore the incident caused by his wayward sister's mistake. He would take responsibility. Larian was surprised to hear Brown's real name. He hadn't expected Pandanian to act first. Larian now knew her name wasn't Brown at all. Even his sister's use of the name had been a mockery. Now that everything was revealed, it would be difficult to return to their previous, placid relationship. Perrianne thanked the Duke for carrying her, but how did he know where her room was? She hadn't told him. The fact that he had personally brought her here and knew the location of her room was already frightening, and the journey had been so quiet. Perhaps this was the same situation, but as far as she knew, he didn't have any frivolous tendencies. He ordered her to sit still, and when Perrianne realized he intended to use healing magic, she calmed down. Come to think of it, he hadn't hesitated to touch her, as if brushing off dust. She had completely misunderstood at first. He treated all of her visible injuries and asked if she was hurt anywhere else, but Perrianne said she was fine. Just then, shouts came from outside. The Western Empire's delegation had arrived en masse, as scheduled. From this moment on, formal exchanges with the previously estranged nation would begin. As a key figure in all of this, why was the Duke still here? Perrianne asked if he shouldn't be greeting them, but he assured her it was all right. They would meet at the banquet anyway. He added that she should also attend the banquet. After all, she was Perrianne's personal maid. The banquet was a feast to welcome the visiting dignitaries, a relatively relaxed setting for receiving guests from another country. It was also a public event related to the marriage negotiations, so even a low-ranking servant like Perrianne had to attend. For Perrianne, mandatory attendance was even better. The banquet was the perfect stage to reveal the imposter Perrianne's true identity, Pandanian said. She needn't worry too much about the Duke's daughter, as she would soon disappear. Larian's recent actions, Pandanian's words, and now the commencement of full diplomatic relations. Did this mean the Duke's daughter had become useless? Why would such crucial information be shared with her? Perrianne decided to ask Duke Pandanian why he was being so kind, beyond simply tending to her wounds. It was outrageous to speak of the Duke's daughter like that in front of her maid. Either he knew she was the real Perrianne, or she was a spy from the Holy Kingdom. The Duke began to speak, looking at her face, but abruptly stopped and ordered her to prepare for the banquet if she didn't want to appear disheveled. Perrianne wondered what was wrong with her face. It was a strange reaction for someone who supposedly hated her. Perhaps his diamond-sharp eyes had recognized her as the true princess, but they wouldn't be seeing each other for much longer anyway, so he could overlook her. Come to think of it, she did look rather dreadful. She couldn't attend a banquet like this, so she should start getting ready. Meanwhile, the Duke's daughter wept in her room, unsure of what to do. The medication was causing problems, and her brother, Larian, hated her. Her maid, Brown, consoled her, saying it would all be over soon. If she just endured a little longer, her accomplishments would be reported to Mr. Exer. If the engagement went smoothly, she would be allowed to kill Brown herself. With that chilling promise, she suggested they go and change. They should be prepared to receive the visiting hunter. Perrianne sat there, repeating to herself that if she carried out her mission successfully, she would be able to kill Brown with her own hands. The banquet, the day of exposing the Duke's false daughter, was finally arriving. Furthermore, not only Hainton, but other important figures would be attending the event. It was the perfect day to expose the imposter. Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was El Bree, holding a gift box. Judging by El Bree's expression, she already knew what the Duke's daughter had done, and the rumors of the Duke caring for her had clearly spread. El Bree said she had brought attire for the event, but in truth, she had prepared it long ago. She had chosen a dress and jewelry she thought would suit Perrianne. In fact, through whispers and rumors, Perrianne was well aware that the princess was displeased with her attendance at the banquet. To publicly humiliate her, a dress resembling a maid's uniform had been prepared. Perhaps Elbree had witnessed this and decided to spend her own money to provide a proper gown. If something went wrong, Elbree could incur the princess's wrath, but why go to such lengths for her? Instead of feeling disheartened by the Duke's daughter's actions, Perrianne was touched by Elbree's pure intentions. Pleased with Perrianne's reaction, Elbree began unpacking the dress and shoes for her to try on. Perrianne worried the dress might be too short, but Elbree assured her that such a style was currently in fashion and that Perrianne looked absolutely beautiful in it. Elbree seemed to adore the dress on Perrianne even more than Perrianne herself. From this, it was clear she was truly fond of the Duke's daughter's image. After the banquet, this would be her last meeting with Elbree, so Perrianne had to ask the question that had been on her mind. She voiced her question: why this fondness for the Duke's daughter? It wasn't meant to be a serious accusation, just genuine curiosity. Was it because she resembled someone Elbree held dear? Then, Elbree asked Perrianne if there was anyone she respected. Unsure of the question's intent, Perrianne confirmed that there was. The first person who came to mind was His Majesty Moment and Now. Though the memories were hazy, Elbree still remembered how the former Duchess and her own mother, Alice, had protected her before their deaths. Lady Alice was a particularly special figure to Elbree. Despite the unsavory rumors that had circulated, they were all lies. There was no one more exceptional. Perrianne, entangled in those same rumors, knew this all too well. But Elbree, hailing from another country, shouldn't have known much about the affairs of the Eastern Empire. How, then, did she know about Perrianne's mother? Perrianne, too, considered the former Duchess a good person. She had performed countless charitable works and left behind a legacy of knightly valor. Lady Alice was a hero to the knights, a figure all her followers should revere. But Elbree's respect for Lady Alice stemmed from more than just this. The country of her birth was one of the nations ravaged by the war. Yes, and that's why Perrianne had been puzzling over Elbree's devotion to the Duke's daughter. Such adoration was usually reserved for those within the Eastern Empire. After the war, the land where Elbree lived had been occupied by the enemy. The new rulers neglected their territory, and many perished from starvation. Back then, she was a child who had lost her parents. If things had continued that way, she likely would have died. But then she appeared, Lady Alice, one of the legendary swordsmen directly under the Imperial Army. That day, Elbree had stolen food and run, but the entire village was swarming with guards. Driven by survival, she hadn't cared, snatching bread and hiding in an alleyway, only to run straight into the guards. As the guards moved to strike her, she thought only of her terrible luck. Then someone intervened, injuring the guard's hand. It was Alice Exer. She said she forgave Elbree, that she should be grateful for the lesson. The lord of the territory was furious that she had caused trouble on his land without permission. Alice knew this well, but when she arrived, she had noticed his territory was in utter chaos. To protect the girl, she offered to duel him, wagering the land itself. Young Elbree was terrified, for the Lord was the strongest knight in the region. But it wasn't because of Elbree. The Lord was enraged by Alice's audacity and the rumors that she only held her position due to the Exer family's influence. She offered to put those rumors to the test. If he won, she would relinquish her position. He could no longer stand by and watch her make her own rules in a foreign land, so he accepted the challenge. As far as he knew, she hadn't seen real combat since the birth of her second child. Now was the time to change her circumstances. He was a knight who had contributed to the war, and he would use this opportunity to seize not only her position, but also this dilapidated region. Elbree worried that because of her, the knight might hurt Lady Alice. But it seemed she had won. With a single blow, she defeated such a powerful lord. What an incredible woman Alice was. She had asked how someone with the lord's strength could make such a fuss over something like this, declaring him a real bastard. It was a stunning story, of course, but Perrianne's own mother was truly the most dazzling figure. Though Perrianne had read of her bravery and outstanding deeds, This was the first time she'd heard her speak so bluntly. In any case, Lady Alice won and became the new lord. Perhaps thanks to the authority of the dukedom, everything went smoothly afterward. Life became much easier. The lady even sent necessities and food at her own expense. In fact, thanks to the lady, she even received a new name. Wanting to repay Alice's kindness, she offered her the most delicious yellow berries she could find. She said the berries looked lovely, just like El Brie. She ate the berries all up, only to find out later that yellow berries were only meant for feeding livestock. From then on, her name became Yellowberry, and those around her called her El Brie for short. This was the first time Perrianne had heard such a detailed account of her mother. Although some things didn't quite align with her memories, her mother was indeed remarkable. Thank heavens, someone still remembered her mother fondly. That was why El Brie wanted to be friends with her daughter. That was why she favored the Duke's daughter. The unfortunate thing was she projected her fantasies onto others. Lady Alice was indeed a wonderful person, but there was no rule that her daughter had to be exactly like her. Disappointed, however, she decided to get close to Perrianne because she looked just like the Duke's daughter. Perrianne was grateful to hear things she hadn't known about her mother. But it was almost time to leave, and the girls decided to freshen up and depart. Today, the charade of the false Perrianne would end. She would unmask herself in front of everyone. Within the Duke of Exeter's complex, Elizabeth Castle was the most beautiful, and to maintain the integrity of its interior, entry was usually forbidden. But today, a banquet was being held here, hosting distinguished guests from the Western Empire. Moreover, this top-down architectural structure clearly indicated that the more important one's status, the higher their position. Despite being assigned to a floor below the top level as the princess's personal maid, even for a free banquet, Perrianne felt somewhat pressured. Finding Juris, Perrianne asked her what was wrong with her eyes, if she had been crying. Noticing the marks on Juris's cheeks, Perrianne commented that she had heard Juris had spoken with the lady about leaving. The girl understood that with the Duke's daughter's strength amplified due to the ointment's side effects, her friend must be enduring immense suffering. Juris didn't deny it. She was tired of appeasing her mistress, regardless. She wanted to return to the Western Empire and seek other employment. She asked her friends what their plans were. Finding work in the Eastern Empire would be difficult if they left Exeter. Perhaps they would like to try their luck in the Western Empire. Suddenly, a commotion rippled through the hall, caused by the appearance of Lord Hainton. As the main character of the day, he was impeccably dressed and elegant, which was why he drew everyone's attention. However, after experiencing those things at the academy, the only normal thing about him was his face. Everything else was repulsive. Perrianne didn't think they would make eye contact, so she quickly turned her head away. Juris also noticed the Lord, commenting that his appearance was certainly impeccable, but if the Duke's daughter were to marry him just like that, it wouldn't end well for her. Juris seemed to know about Hainton's dark side. Her reaction wasn't like someone who had merely heard rumors about him, but rather someone who truly knew everything. It was Juris, wasn't it? No, she'd only just realized. A skilled mage of the Western Empire, she now had to figure out how to reach the upper floor to carry out her plan. She needed to get close to the Duke's daughter. Just then, a young man informed her that the Lord was summoning her upstairs. Though he called her upstairs promptly, they were merely graduates of the same academy, so she couldn't feign familiarity. Meanwhile, her friends were puzzled by her being called Perry instead of Brown, and how she knew the Lord. They speculated that she was a graduate of the Western Academy, and perhaps they'd met there. Perry had no chance to explain the whole situation to these two, so she had to head to the upper-level stage. As she'd thought, the atmosphere there was indeed different, but among everyone, Lord Hainton, Monton von Dome, stood out the most. He wore a silk suit in the Western Empire style, considered the most precious fabric, dazzling white gloves, and possessed a distinct, innate air of authority. It seemed he still commanded a room with ease. Upon noticing Perry, the Lord left the princess and approached her. Even during their time at the academy, he'd worn this mask of benevolence while manipulating others. Hainton remarked that although they hadn't seen each other in a while, she had grown up considerably, speaking as if they'd just graduated yesterday and she'd already matured so much. Perrianne, the princess, remained bewildered. He had completely ignored her turning away just like that. This could only mean he knew she was an imposter. Otherwise, it would be difficult to insult someone so openly. But then he said that he'd heard she'd been having a difficult time because of Lady Perrianne, which threw her into confusion. He abruptly asked her what his intentions were, as if he'd noticed she was being mistreated by the lady. He suggested that she was attracting a lot of attention because she resembled the Duke's daughter, but that she didn't enjoy the spotlight. Perry replied that she was honored to resemble the Duke's daughter, but that he frightened her. He couldn't possibly know everything in such detail, but asking such questions in such a prominent place couldn't be a coincidence. Perhaps he intended to insult the Duke's daughter. The Lord, noticing they were attracting attention, suggested they retire to a separate room. But Perrianne intervened. This girl, though she looked like her, had no right to be alone with him. Furthermore, she was busy with her duties as a maid, and this would damage the lady's dignity. But the Lord merely scoffed at these excuses. Perrianne began frantically adding more justifications. Perry couldn't believe she'd become so agitated just because things weren't going according to plan. Clearly, this was another side effect. The Lord cut her off, stating that it wasn't Perry who resembled her, but rather that she only vaguely resembled Perry. And Perry wasn't very bright. She probably didn't know that the princess was in love with him. Unlike her, he didn't think conversing with Perry would damage his dignity in any way. With that, he walked away. Perrianne didn't stop there. She demanded to know how he could be so friendly to that girl if they graduated from the same academy. Did he know what she'd done at the academy? She'd nearly been expelled from the academy for fighting. Perrianne thought he wouldn't be so blunt. If he associated with such an unruly girl, the gentleman wouldn't be able to assess the situation rationally, and his reputation would plummet. Lord Hayton replied that, in that situation, Perrianne had been protecting him, and he wished the Duke's daughter wouldn't make such pronouncements without knowing the full story. Hayton then escorted Perrianne away. The Duke's daughter seethed, convinced that this brown-haired girl, besides her brothers, was trying to steal Lord Hayton from her, and she silently vowed to destroy her. Left alone, Perrianne thanked him for his help, but they weren't that close, and he likely knew the incident at the academy happened for other reasons. Why would he lie? He had no pressing reason to, and he'd only just asked Perrianne if she knew why the Pandorians had been adopted. The girl couldn't understand why he would ask such a thing, but since she didn't know, he had nothing more to say. If she was curious, she could ask the Duke directly, and he would surely answer her. Of course, she had been interested in the reason before, but no matter how much she investigated, she couldn't find any clues. Bart Pandorian wouldn't casually tell such things to an ordinary servant. Why was he so certain? It was too strange to leave it at that. She had to find out why he said such a thing before the banquet ended. She immediately chased after him, but where had he gone? Just then, someone called out to her. It was the Duke's daughter, asking if Perrianne had something going on with Lord Hayton, her eyes completely vacant. She demanded to know how Perrianne had seduced him, making her face look like the Duke's daughter, using her body to entice him. Perrianne pleaded with the young woman to believe her, that she truly had nothing to do with Lord Hayton, but the Duke's daughter wouldn't listen. If that were the case, then why was he only so polite to her? If he was being so careless in front of everyone, then now was the time to put her plan into action. A maid brought her some cold water, telling her to drink it and calm down. The Duke's daughter furiously snatched the glass, indignant that a mere servant dared to order her around. This was the beginning of a grand scheme. The maids she saw were agents of their kingdom, and at her signal, they served the Duke's daughter water mixed with her saliva. This would neutralize the monster byproduct, while simultaneously sending the monster into a frenzy. Due to the continued use of the byproduct, the Duke's daughter had already become half monster, and she would soon reveal her true form. If the Duke's daughter's identity was exposed at the banquet, the matter wouldn't simply be covered up for the benefit of certain powers. Moreover, there was a spirit beast here. If the Duke's daughter started to transform into a monster, the spirit beast would attack her. The Duke's daughter frantically ran to the top floor to find the spirit beast, unaware of what was transpiring. Finally, someone in the crowd noticed the spirit beast heading towards the Duke's daughter. Someone began to call out for Perrianne. At this distance, it would be impossible to stop the beast with a sword. The final condition for completing the plan was to be attacked in place of the Duke's daughter in front of everyone. If Perrianne's blood made contact with the Duke's daughter like this, it would act as a catalyst, accelerating Perrianne's transformation into a monster. Now the whole world would know she'd consumed the monster byproduct. The plan had worked perfectly. If they believed the maid was dead, returning to the Holy Kingdom would be that much easier. Someone in the crowd shouted that the Duke's daughter had consumed the byproduct. Perhaps someone higher up was behind it all, aiming not to kill, but to capture her alive. This would reveal that the Exer family had also been deceived. They wouldn't be accused of colluding with the imposter, Perry, to harm Lord Hainton. This wouldn't harm the Holy Kingdom, and her mission was complete. The plan was a success, but then Perrianne came running, trying to shake her awake. Perry couldn't understand what he wanted. Come to think of it, she hadn't asked Hunton what he'd heard, but they wouldn't see each other again, so what did it matter? Meanwhile, the monster that had once been the Duke's daughter went on a rampage, preventing the knights from approaching. The former Duke Riso wondered how this could have happened. Why? His daughter, born in the Exeter dukedom, had wanted for nothing, her every whim catered to. He'd had no doubt that his life would continue this idyllically until that day, 26 years ago, when he saw the child's hair color. Deep blue hair. This wasn't simply genetics. It was a trait caused by a long-standing contract with the dragon. If one belonged to the Exer bloodline, one would never be born with brown hair. Yet, the child his beloved wife, Alice Exer, had born was not his but another man's. The child's hair was chestnut brown. He'd pleaded with Alice to tell him the truth, to admit her wrongdoing, her momentary lapse in judgment. If only she had apologized, at least. But Alice had merely asked him what was wrong. She knew perfectly well. She understood, at the very least, what she had done. How could anyone constantly cherish such an unsightly thing? This child, every time she was seen, they would whisper about her immorality. It would forever be a stain on the reputation of Larian and Phoenix. If he disposed of a child or interrogated Alice, she might leave him forever. She wasn't bound by the title of Duchess. A free person, so much the better. He would protect this child, allow no one to find fault. He loved Alice so much that he pretended not to know her secret. To prevent anyone from daring to point out the child's hair color, Larian and Phoenix would also pretend to love her dearly. From now on, he would personally care for the child. Caring for a newborn wasn't easy, but he would manage it perfectly. Let Alice see the sacrifices he made to raise this child. Watch him dote on a child, not his own, for the sake of her honor. He tried his best to raise a child he didn't even love. As time passed, he finally realized that from the moment he decided to raise this child, he was destined to lose. After he finally decided to accept the child, those in the castle who thought there was a problem with Perrianne's hair color disappeared. It was as if all the problems had vanished, but an invisible crack was gradually widening. Perrianne finally reached the age where she could lift a sword. Since Alice was skilled with a sword, she should have some talent for swordsmanship as well. Even if she wasn't as skilled as her brothers, she should at least be able to demonstrate her abilities. The days came flooding back, the days when he'd first realized this child wasn't his blood. But Perrianne was no different from his daughter now. He'd vowed not to hesitate under any circumstances, but then he'd learned the Duchess had fallen in battle not far from the carriage, dozens of fatal wounds marking her body. And yet, Perrianne had emerged from the overturned carriage unscathed. The Alice he knew wouldn't have died so easily, even in a surprise attack. So Alice had sacrificed herself to protect Perrianne. Afterward, the world learned that a man claiming to be Perrianne's biological father had appeared, revealing she carried none of the Exer family blood. The Exer family handed her over to the tower, confining her there until adulthood. What people didn't know, however, was that contrary to appearances, the tower was a remarkable structure. Built for monster research, it boasted the latest equipment. The lower floors consisted of luxurious quarters for senior researchers, and the basement housed a garden and even a freshwater swimming pool. It could be seen, then, as a gesture of care from the deceived Duke. He ordered that upon the completion of her confinement, she must seek him out for permission to leave, and they would meet again then. It pained him not to keep the child by his side, but when the time came, when the child had grown, Perrianne awoke in bed, bewildered as to why she was still alive. If everything had gone according to plan, she should have been presumed dead. She was summoned, and the former Duke Riso appeared before her. But what was he doing here? Perrianne started to ask his business, but the Duke cut her off, saying she had pleaded for Perrianne's rescue, reckless of her own safety. The girl grew apprehensive, inquiring after the Duchess's well-being, though she knew in her heart it was a futile question. Riso told her that it wasn't the Duchess she had saved, but a monster. The maid continued to feign surprise. He had been blinded by the illusion, never suspecting she was a monster, blinded by the fact he had believed her to be his own daughter. Perrianne turned to the former Duke, asking if he was all right, what had happened. As he'd said, it wasn't the Duchess, but a monster. After she lost consciousness, the knights managed to capture the monster and imprison her in the dungeons. She had been unconscious for 10 days. So before the Holy Kingdom agents were supposed to steal her body, Perrianne's wounds had healed. What had happened? The former Duke recalled their first meeting, his promise to do anything if she remained loyal. This time, she had proven her loyalty by sacrificing her life. So now he had to repay her with something. What did she want? Her only desire was to prevent the collusion between the Eastern and Western empires. She had originally come here for that very reason, which was why she had exposed the Duke's false daughter on such a grand scale. However, there had already been a plot between the empires to use the Duchess. In that case, they might find another way to join forces, and she wouldn't be able to stop them. In that case, a gamble had to be made. She requested that he prevent Lord Hainton and Duke Bart Pandorian from colluding. She requested a guarantee of minimal autonomy for all trade passing through the Holy Kingdom. The Duke chuckled, remarking on the unusual nature of her wish. To this, Perrianne replied that she was a citizen of the kingdom and didn't want her homeland to suffer. She had contemplated this request ever since she'd had the opportunity to become a servant. But the excuse hadn't worked on the Duke as well as she'd anticipated. Riso admitted it was an uncomfortable request, but as he himself had stated, he would grant her any wish. He agreed, and Perrianne was surprised by his willingness to so readily comply with such an absurd request. Even though he had relinquished his position as Duke, he still wielded considerable power. If he honored her request, the Holy Kingdom would at least have some small reprieve. She thanked the gentleman, and he concluded their conversation, but then added that she seemed to be acquainted with Lord Hainton. He described Hainton as courteous and decent, but noted a duplicity within the man. He cautioned her to be wary of men who whispered sweet nothings of love. He offered this advice as a father with a daughter. Finally, she posed a question. Since Perrianne's hair color was different, clearly indicating she wasn't of Exer blood, why had he continued to search for her? The Duke replied that because she was his daughter, blood relation didn't matter. He knew the child must still be alive, as he had never seen her body with his own eyes. Anger flared within Perrianne. He hadn't even recognized his own flesh and blood standing right before him. She hadn't learned the truth of her parentage until 2 years after escaping the tower. That day had begun like any other. As usual, she'd teased Mello by causing tremors where he stood, and finally, she pushed all her abilities to their absolute limit. It was then, in that instant, that her light brown hair turned raven black. When she saw the transformation, she was instantly reminded of her mother, who had cherished and protected her until the very end. She had never stopped loving her mother, but beneath that love, resentment had always lingered. Why had she given birth to her? Had she truly betrayed her country? If so, then the Duke's anger was justified. She ached, knowing she didn't even have the right to regret her own miserable life. But when her true hair color revealed itself, she realized she had never been a bastard child. Her mother had never betrayed anyone. Her confident demeanor had never been a lie. The condition for the color change was simple: exhaust all of her power until it was completely depleted. When her spent strength returned, so too would her original hair color. But why did her hair change like this? Perhaps Her Majesty, the Queen, knew the reason. Because in Perrianne's eyes, the Queen was a magnificent, all-knowing being. But she hesitated to ask her savior such questions. It might appear as though she harbored hopes of returning to the Exer family. Besides, the Exer family's hair color had nothing to do with her anymore. If the Duke had believed her mother, if she had learned to use her powers sooner, so many things might have been different. Such hypotheticals were pointless now. She shouldn't try to understand the former Duke's feelings. She had her own matters to consider. First, her body hadn't died and been resurrected. Someone who could revive even after having their heart pierced by a spirit beast possessed immense power. She remembered that before she lost consciousness, Pandorian had run towards her, not used healing magic to revive her, because he had already healed her wounds. But his thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Pandorian. What a coincidence. She had just been thinking about him. But why was he here? He angrily demanded to know why she had protected her. Perrianne calmly replied that her job was to protect the Duchess, and she hadn't known she was an imposter. The Duke didn't believe her. Even if she were telling the truth, there was no reason to sacrifice herself for her. Had she gone mad, saving someone who had tormented and abused her? He had always found her attitude towards the Duke's daughter strange, but now everything had become clear. It seemed she couldn't leave her side, which meant she was a spy. When Perrianne noticed what she had done that gave her away, she began to deny everything. He asked if she was a spy sent by the Western Empire. The girl was even more shocked, and she denied it. Suddenly, he started talking about the Western Empire. She didn't understand why he would think that. Then how did she know Hayden? He felt they were close, so he had drawn his conclusions when he saw her with him at the banquet. She said it might sound like a lie to him, but she truly had no connection to Lord Hayden. She had simply played along with his act when he pretended to know her. Perrianne concluded, judging by her eyes, that she wasn't lying. He hadn't sensed any change in her pulse or body temperature either. At least the part about her having no connection to Hayden was true. But he was also worried that she was a graduate of Adame, the Western Empire's academy. Then he asked what they had talked about in the other room. Did she really think she had fooled him by telling him about the Eastern Empire? She recalled the conversation. The Duchess had said if she wanted to know how he had been adopted by the Duke, to ask Perrianne herself, and he would surely answer. The conversation had been about him, but if she didn't want to arouse suspicion, she had to say something. She told him the truth, saying they had talked about the reason for the Duke's adoption of him, and that he would tell her if she asked, but of course he might not answer. She had simply told him honestly about that day's conversation. He replied that there was no need to make a fuss over such a trivial matter. He could tell her. Was it really that simple? Perhaps it was because there really wasn't anything special to it. The reason he had been adopted by the Exer family was because he was a high-quality puppet for the Duke's daughter. In order for the Duke's daughter to be able to return, he was a pawn to ensure that everything belonging to the Exer family was handed over to their daughter. So he had been adopted to marry Duchess Perrianne. Even the Exer ducal family, who valued bloodline, had abandoned their own daughter, yet adopted Perrianne, who was completely unrelated to them. But the reason was to marry her. Perrianne had been adopted knowing all of this. If that was the case, how had he felt at the time? The Duke continued speaking, saying that this was how it all began, and after this, the former Duke started spouting all sorts of nonsense to him. Live as you please, he said. He regretted it, but it didn't matter anymore. Once he reached the duchy, everything would proceed according to his will. His confidence in his own abilities was astounding. Even though it had nothing to do with her, Perrianne felt a pang of sadness. The Duke disliked the expression on her face. If she was trying to comfort him, there was no need. He was truly fine. In fact, Perrianne would prefer it if he wasn't fine. His contentment made her uneasy. But why was the Duke telling her all this? She was just a servant. Even if she knew, it wouldn't harm him. If rumors spread, he could easily dismiss them as nonsense. She couldn't understand his reasoning, and neither could he, it seemed. Perhaps it was because she resembled Lady Perrianne, though he'd never actually met the Duke's daughter. Perrianne didn't understand what she meant. He had met the real Lady Perrianne before. A knight burst into the room, reporting that the underground prison had been destroyed, the cell holding the imposter. The Duke worried they'd lost her. At this interruption, he ended the conversation. But why at that crucial moment? If she had known, she would have destroyed it later. She hadn't known they would have such an important conversation. But now, the damage was done. Meanwhile, in the ruins of the dungeon, the Duke's false daughter was disoriented and confused. One moment, she was in the underground prison. The next, she was unconscious after a violent tremor. Had someone actually attacked the prison to rescue her? Earthquakes were unheard of in this region. This was clearly a deliberate act. She worried that things hadn't gone smoothly, but thankfully, she hadn't been cast aside. She wasn't like those others who had been used and discarded. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. Relief flooded her. Someone had come to save her. "Please, hurry," she cried out. Surprise jolted through her as she saw the brown-haired woman standing before her. But why was she here? Who was she? Why was she here? Perrianne thought it a rather rude greeting, but nonetheless replied, "Miss Cecil, please don't be too alarmed." How did this girl know her real name? Who was she? She'd certainly never formally introduced herself. She decided to reveal her own true identity. "I am Perrianne EXR," she declared. Cecil could hardly believe it. That hair color, just like the EXOR family. Could this brown-haired woman truly be the real Perrianne? It was impossible. Not only was the Duke's daughter supposed to be dead, but she was also supposed to be an invalid. So she had dyed her hair brown on purpose. But why would her hair be like this? Perrianne wished her hair would stay brown, but it changed like this whenever she used her powers. It was a constant annoyance. She was irritated by this color everyone envied. Cecil was incensed by such flippancy. Perrianne suggested they dispense with the small talk and get to the point. She asked for Cecil's agreement on what she was about to say. Hoping for someone to rescue Miss Cecil was futile, but she didn't yet understand their organization. They would come for her to check if she had divulged any secrets. Trying to sway her to their side was pointless, especially since she had already revealed herself as the Duke's daughter. Her life was guaranteed. As expected, she had backup, and it seemed substantial. They needed to send Mello to gather more information. Cecil would be taken by the organization. Until the truth was confirmed, she would be subjected to experiments and interrogation. The imposter Duchess raged at Perrianne, mocking her for relying on the very organization members she'd so easily defeated. How could these people, these agents, be brought down by a single girl? Perrianne had foolishly revealed her secret, or perhaps she was simply a fool. Why expose herself? This was a man-made cavern 500 meters underground. No one could possibly come to Cecil's rescue. Even if she died here, there would be no escape. She had overheard things she shouldn't have. The organization members falling from the ceiling, the roar, and the earthquake that had rocked the prison. All of it was this girl's doing. The negotiation was over. Cecil was unconscious. Now, they needed to completely evacuate this cavern and transport her to the Holy Kingdom. But before that, there were matters to attend to. The Duchess's room was empty, meaning she had nothing on her person. A legendary artifact, capable of altering one's appearance, had been discovered. If the imposter possessed it, she might use it to escape. It had to be retrieved. Perhaps the imposter wouldn't need it. She could alter her appearance at will, after all. But Mello and Her Majesty might find it useful. Such a precious item, yet it looked so ordinary. Suddenly, the artifact's light began to seep into her, a warm energy flowing through her body. This was the power of the artifact. It cracked, and the light vanished. Had she actually broken it? She would leave the rest to Mello. With that task complete, she should move on to the next. Now, she needed to properly deal with the fallout bit by bit. As she'd expected, the atmosphere in the duchy was grim. Phoenix, who had always been kind to her, was heartbroken to learn the Duchess was an imposter. Even Laren, who had known the truth, seemed strangely devastated. Then he'd call for her, proposing she stay as a source of comfort for them. Such an absurd notion. Now that the imposter posing as his sister had been apprehended, someone else was needed to fill that role, so they could remember the deceased child. A face resembling his sister would remain here, a solace for their grief. Even though he believed the Duchess was dead, he wanted to keep her close, like a doll, simply because she resembled his sister. No matter how she treated him, in time she would grow accustomed to it. They would be together for a long time. But Perrianne had no intention of replacing the deceased Duchess as Lord Laren's comfort. What they needed wasn't her, but common sense and a therapist. The sheer audacity of it infuriated her, and the words tumbled out. Yet, why did he remain silent? Someone like Laren could have had her executed for such insolence. He asked her to say one thing. Perrianne, being kind, decided she could use this as a guide for future actions. She clearly warned him of her impending departure, hoping to avoid any misunderstandings in the future. She wished him well as she left. It was truly bizarre. Not just Phoenix, but Laren too. Why were they acting so strangely? Once they had cast her aside, they should have continued living happily as they had before. But it was enough. The imposter Duchess had been exposed. Her mission was complete. The rest they would have to resolve themselves. She too, with the passage of time, would cast aside her grief and regrets and find her true self. Having visited Phoenix and Laren, she now needed to bid farewell to the staff of the duchy. Perry met Elberry and Juris. Elberry asked if everything was finally over, while Juris complained that Perry could have been resting. Perry inquired what the girls were doing, as there was still work to be done even with the Duchess gone. Elberry then presented her letter of resignation. Juris, it turned out, was there for the same reason. Elberry had decided to resign, and Juris had come to seek approval. Elberry had received a generous severance package, so generous in fact that it left her beaming. She whispered the amount in Perry's ear, and Perry was astonished. It was enough for Elberry to live comfortably for the rest of her life, yet the girl was still determined to find work. This meant she would be free for a while. It would be a great help if she moved to their kingdom. They would have an excellent addition to their ranks. Juris, however, interjected, explaining that Elberry had already received an invitation from a renowned knightly order, which meant she was already highly sought after. Though a capable knight, Elberry hadn't considered it at all. Indeed, it would be a shame to confine such a promising young knight to the Holy Kingdom. So, whatever she chose, Perry encouraged her to weigh everything carefully and select the best offer, hoping she would find true happiness. Juris then asked Perry about her own plans. Staying on would be fine, but there wasn't likely to be much work in the Holy Kingdom. In truth, Perry had also decided to resign and was about to tell them. Just then, Phoenix appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. Perry felt a strange sense of déjà vu. He couldn't believe she wanted to leave. Now that the Duchess was gone, her role was over. What was there left for her to do at the Duchy after everything that had happened at the banquet? Phoenix's arrival at this moment was unfortunate, but Perry had no intention of changing her mind. It was best to settle everything now. Phoenix, exasperated, asked what she was thinking. Did she think jobs like this at the Duchy were easy to come by? Perry was taken aback. Workplace, she thought. That was what surprised him. Since Perry was still young, he insisted she listen to his advice as an elder, advice given out of genuine concern. She knew the difference between a kingdom and an empire. To put it bluntly, success was difficult to achieve in the Holy Kingdom. In that case, he could help. She would overcome it all through hard work. It seemed Phoenix was saying all this now because he was worried about her future, but she couldn't be sure if it was genuine concern or another way to keep her at the Duchy. She had already thought everything through and made her decision. She appreciated his concern, but more importantly, she was worried about his well-being. He had been through a difficult time because of the imposter. Had he felt better after crying? Even so, he had believed Perrianne was an imposter, and it was his fault for feeling disgusted, even if she had become different from the person he knew. But during those difficult times, when he couldn't shake the feeling of repulsion, she had appeared, looking like Perrianne, much to his surprise. After that, she had started to resemble the Perrianne of his childhood more than the imposter. She had foreseen this as a child, but she hadn't expected to hear it firsthand. Phoenix began to ponder why he had started to see Miss Perry as a younger sister. He realized he felt disgusted by how his father and brothers had buried the past and treated Perry and, well, everyone as if their transgressions had vanished. But he wasn't so different from them. When he saw her, he'd never wronged her, never needed to repent or tread carefully. He could recall his happy times with Perrianne without guilt, though. He pretended not to understand his father and brother's obsession. In the end, he, too, wanted comfort and an apology from Miss Perry. Now, he decided to confess, albeit belatedly. Since they had spent time together, perhaps it was worth seeking solace. Not just Mr. Phoenix. Everyone projected their fantasies onto others as they pleased. They lived on expectations and the comfort they offered. She didn't care for any of it, so there was no point in apologizing for it. Perhaps the Duke's real daughter would have thought it was all fine. He wished she really thought so. He missed his sister terribly. He was grateful for everything Miss Perry had done. This was definitely the end for Phoenix. Since she had bid him farewell, there was nothing left to do. As soon as dawn broke, she would prepare to leave. The day to depart this place had arrived. But at her door, she found Laren. Was he really going to bring up that request again? She thought they had finished that conversation last time. Why was he still outside her room? He asked if Perrianne was really going to leave them. He was completely delusional. He had already decided she was Perrianne. He apologized and left. For a madman, he left far too calmly, openly calling her Perrianne. She had expected him to do something. While slightly unsettling, the main thing was that tomorrow they wouldn't bother her anymore. She wouldn't be in this castle any longer. Preparations complete, Perry was about to return to the Holy Kingdom, but a maid rushed to her room, exclaiming about how fortunate it was that she hadn't left yet, asking if she'd seen today's newspaper. Her house was gone, demolished due to the transport of a giant wyvern. What absurdity! Why would they transport something like that through a residential area? Thankfully, her severance pay had arrived in her Holy Kingdom bank account yesterday, so she could find lodging. The maid then suggested she look at the article on the next page. A wyvern transported through a residential area, funds frozen in the Holy Kingdom bank, someone capable of orchestrating such ludicrous events. Laren. No wonder he'd left so calmly. It must have been for this. Perry trembled with rage. So this was what he had decided to do. While she had refused to stay at the castle, she never imagined he would resort to such methods to keep her here. Lodging and money weren't an issue for her, but being caught in this kind of trouble was another matter entirely. She had to leave regardless, so she needed to file a complaint with the Legion. She decided to use her underworld contacts to find out where he was. He wasn't in his office. Then she checked his room, where she heard Phoenix's voice. He was yelling at Laren. Why was he like this? It was the first time she had seen him so angry. Why were these two arguing? His beloved sister was a fake, and this was the result. Why create problems in other people's lives? He demanded. Phoenix had discovered his brother's scheme, asking a simple question, why? But Laren retorted, hadn't he himself started to rely on Perry too? It had worked out well for him, so he didn't understand why Phoenix was angry. What exactly is the issue we're discussing? Phoenix admitted he hadn't acted directly, but he had instigated his brother. Because of this, Perry now had nowhere to go and was clearly in a difficult situation thanks to Laren. When asked if he was angry at his brother because of another girl, Phoenix became agitated. He said it wasn't the time to talk about that, but then paused, considering the reason. His brother wasn't that kind of person, so why had he become so different? Though he wished Laren would explain himself, why he'd gone mad, what he had seen in that place. Then Laren retorted that he had already explained everything to Phoenix. Was Laren really going to keep this up until the very end? He himself didn't even know if his brother truly saw him as family. What did it all mean? Laren hadn't always been this erratic. According to Phoenix, he started acting strangely after seeing something. What could it have been? What else didn't she know? If that was the case, the argument with Laren should be postponed. If she treated her brother like that, what could he possibly do to her? It was best to go to Phoenix. Her words would have an effect on him. Sure enough, he came here after arguing with Laren, which was easy to predict. Perry called out to him. He replied that she seemed distracted. He'd heard she couldn't go home and that she was looking for him because of it. She was in a foul mood and asked if he wanted to grab a drink. Only alcohol could wash away this kind of frustration. Phoenix was surprised, given her predicament was due to his brother. Given the circumstances, he asked what she planned to do next. She had family in the Holy Kingdom, so she had no choice but to go to them. Phoenix was intrigued. She'd never mentioned them before. Despite losing her immediate family, there were still people who considered her family. Phoenix agreed. They must be good people. But sometimes she envied their relationship. Just being blood relatives didn't necessarily make them a good family. But what if she had been born into that family from the start? Sometimes they kept important things from her, and sometimes she felt excluded, wanting to share their burdens. Phoenix hadn't realized she was troubled by the same things. He sometimes felt like an outsider too. Of course, she knew if she spoke first, he would open up. He especially felt like his brother was hiding something important from him. Perry feigned surprise, but earlier, when they had dinner together, she thought they had a good relationship. Phoenix confirmed this. But now he was different. He had indeed become strange. And this happened around the time he discovered Perrianne's disappearance from the tower. The secret came to light for a simple reason. Suspicious elements were found in the tower's transaction reports provided by Perrianne's supposed biological father. Her father, finding the unknown sources and unusual amounts strange, decided to investigate the tower. The leader of the team dispatched to the tower to investigate was Laren Exer, his brother. Then they would bring Perrianne to the castle, as the tower had to be completely emptied. He and his brother had already known the reason their father sent troops to the tower. It was a pretext to bring Perrianne to the castle. So, Laren and a group of investigators went to the tower, brimming with anticipation. Upon arrival, Laren and his companions were met with a gruesome sight, doll-like figures, resembling corpses, scattered around like refuse. Only traces of Perrianne's presence, signs of her torment, remained. She herself was nowhere to be found. The place was devoid of even a living breath, as if no one had ever resided there. This implied that Solarian had changed after visiting the tower. But having witnessed such a scene, it was natural for him to be psychologically affected. Phoenix countered, arguing that the world wasn't privy to the full story. Laren had initially entered alone. Perry, hearing this for the first time, thought perhaps he'd gone in alone, eager to see his sister as quickly as possible. It would have been a reasonable explanation, but then a member of the investigative team revealed that after entering the tower, Laren had locked the door from the inside. Speculation ran rampant among the investigators, but Laren claimed he'd locked it to preserve the crime scene. Phoenix believed his brother had seen something inside that tower, something disturbing enough to unsettle even his argumentative and level-headed brother. Something truly shocking. Him entering the tower alone and the door remaining locked for a period of time was an unsettling narrative. However, it wasn't sufficient reason to conclude that this was the cause of Solarian's strange behavior. Others had entered the tower as well, and their lives remained unchanged. That's what people might think. But the truth was the world remained ignorant of more than just that single fact. Laren hadn't emerged from the tower for 3 days. A chill of dread washed over Perry at this revelation. She had assumed Phoenix was exaggerating about the tower incident, but if 3 days had passed, there was definitely something suspicious about it. What had happened to Laren in the tower? What had Perrianne endured in that cursed place? Were those corpse-like dolls? Perrianne must have been terrified. Of course, she had experienced something unpleasant in the tower, but it was different from what Phoenix had gone through. She had made all those dolls. Her initial reason for crafting them was her longing for her family. Later, when she fell ill, she created the dolls to move around for her, which explained the abundance of small, girl-shaped figures. There was just one thing, one piece without a sinister motive, that she couldn't reveal to Phoenix. She could, however, disclose other truths. She understood why he believed these events had affected Laren. However, Laren's silence about the tower wasn't an attempt to distance himself from Phoenix. Even when the Duke's false daughter appeared, Phoenix still remembered and cherished the memories of her as a child. The same was true for Laren. In his eyes, Phoenix was still the younger brother who needed looking after. Phoenix was fixated on the fact that his brother had become strange, failing to consider other perspectives. He assumed Laren was withholding information out of malice. But if he were in his brother's shoes, he probably wouldn't want to worry him either. He felt their family was irrevocably falling apart. But if Laren still held onto hope for reconciliation, he abruptly jumped up from his seat. He needed to go to his brother now. Perry wondered if such a drastic action was too much, considering their recent argument. Now the two would reconcile. Hopefully, he could persuade him, and she could return safely to the Holy Kingdom. Phoenix burst into the office Laren had just stormed out of. He thought back to when he was still small, when Perrianne had left the castle. The decision had been made against his will. Of course, there were circumstances he didn't understand, but he knew his brother felt even more guilt. Despite that, he was old enough for Laren to rely on. No matter what happened, no matter what mistakes he made, he wouldn't abandon him. Now, he was offering to shoulder the burden together. So he had pleaded for Perry to be allowed to leave. He also knew that no one could replace Perrianne. Laren had retorted that he'd become frivolous since getting mixed up with that maid. What's sharing the burden? It meant that from now on, Phoenix would change. His brother demanded he stop talking nonsense. He really shouldn't have met that girl again. Maybe he should just get rid of her. Was he referring to having Perry leave? So be it. It would be better if she never appeared before him again. It seemed he had finally given in. They could change slowly, even if Perry was no longer in the castle. It was hard to believe she could leave the Duke's territory without incident. Phoenix had actually reconciled with his brother after talking with her, persuading Laren not to keep her. Even so, he hadn't even forgotten to say goodbye to her. It had been useful in the end. Finally, she would return to the Holy Kingdom. When she arrived there, she must immediately go to see Her Majesty the Queen, to see her real family, not the ones who had abandoned her before. Mello was furious. He had demanded the imposter be eliminated, not a fake suicide arranged. Perry defended herself, saying she had completed her mission, so why attack her? She asked where Her Majesty was, but she had already gone to the new continent and wouldn't be back for several months. She had known for a long time that the queen of the country was on the verge of collapse and had to run around personally to solve problems. But she wanted to report to Her Majesty first. Mello was still worried, but glad she had returned safely. Then, he demanded a detailed report of what had happened during this time. The operation of Cecile's organization, who was sponsoring the organization, and then the leader who controlled it all. As she traced it back to the top, one by one, she finally discovered who had sent the imposter. That person was Hauntain Windham. She had been wondering how Hauntain knew the Duke's daughter was a fake, but in fact, he was involved in everything. Because the maid had told Cecile that her achievements would be reported to Mr. Roxanne. More precisely, everything was led by Hauntain's uncle, Roxanne. After all, they were all members of the Windham family, likely with the same goals. If the Windham family was behind it, it would be difficult to do anything. She had finally figured it out, but why was everything so messy? You couldn't make an enemy of the most powerful person in the Western Empire, so ultimately, this wouldn't benefit them much. Maybe the opposite was true. They had found evidence regarding her mother's death and what happened in the tower. That bastard Roxanne had orchestrated it all. What was he saying? What right did he have to say that? In fact, he and Her Majesty. Everyone had assumed the Duke's imposter daughter was the key to unraveling the mystery of her mother's death. But why? When the imposter appeared, her picture was plastered all over the newspapers, and that face, it did resemble her. But people had only seen Perrianne at the age of 3, yet they perfectly recreated her adult appearance. Thinking about it carefully, the resemblance was far too precise. Clearly, it would be incredibly difficult to reconstruct such an adult face based solely on the appearance of a child. This means they weren't working from her appearance at 3 years old. To recreate her face so accurately, they must have had more recent information. For example, what she looked like when she left the tower at 11. Knowing her appearance then would make it easy to predict what she'd look like as an adult. So they sent Perrianne to investigate, to confirm whether the imposter's resemblance was a coincidence or orchestrated by some organization. It seems Hauntain Windam was behind all of this, which means he must have seen her in the tower. However, why did the Queen and Mello hide the truth from her? She understood why they sent her, but why conceal such a crucial fact? They should have told her to investigate immediately, or at least hinted at it before she went to Exeter. They did investigate without her knowledge, but found nothing. She asked why, and it was, of course, out of concern for her. If she could remain calm after learning the truth, then everything would go smoothly when meeting S's and the Lord. They likely kept it a secret for fear she would be nervous and approach the mission with prejudice. She wouldn't blame them. Perry stood to leave, and Mello asked where she was going. She replied that she wanted to gather her thoughts. The prince berated himself. He knew she would react this way, which is why he didn't want to say anything. He knew this secret couldn't be kept forever, but seeing her reaction, he couldn't stay composed. Besides, there was one more fact he hadn't told Perry. What made him and the Queen suspicious was Perry's hair changing color, revealing her as a true descendant of the S's family. Her Majesty asked what was wrong, and Mello said not to ask, that she had run off to the basement to cry. He thought it best to leave her alone, to let her cry it out. More importantly, Mello felt it too. All the incidents involving Perry seemed strange. Until now, they had believed the brown-haired man who took Perry away was her real father. Claiming to be the father of the Duke's daughter in front of the Duke himself was an act punishable by beheading. So he reasoned that if the man wasn't her real father, he wouldn't have taken such a risk. But if Perry truly had the Duke's blood, then that man was an imposter. Why would he lie like that? The answer was clear. Their target from the very beginning was Perry. They didn't drive her out because the Duchess died. They killed the Duchess because they were targeting Perry. So this wasn't some tragic coincidence that ruined her life, but a plot orchestrated from the start by an organization large enough to dare lay hands on the Duchess. Therefore, they couldn't leave behind any trace of what they were trying to unearth. From that moment on, he and the Queen had been secretly investigating their identities. He couldn't tell Perry that they had killed her mother just to kidnap her. If the imposter hadn't appeared, they wouldn't have sent her to the Eastern Empire. But the fact was, thanks to this incident, they had obtained crucial intelligence. The intelligence revealed that Rockstar Windam, the regent of the Western Empire, was also involved. He had anticipated a powerful figure behind it all, but not someone of this magnitude. If they acted too hastily, there was no telling what damage it would inflict upon the kingdom. They had to weaken Wyndham's political influence and seize control of the situation. However, the Holy Kingdom's power was barely holding on, and the path to resistance was clear. Those with political power and a willingness to cooperate. Those within the tower who held influence rivaling the Windam family. If swallowing his pride could resolve the issue, then so be it. But to reveal everything and seek help, he would have to disclose that Perry was the Duke's true daughter, which would play right into their hands. If he possessed power equivalent to the S's family, he wouldn't need to hesitate now. Phoenix heard the women's voices, noting how different they were from a maid's. He felt like a fool. This had never happened before. Why was he acting so strangely just thinking about that maid? Come to think of it, he had personally carried her to her room and even said things he shouldn't have. Wait, why had he been so deferential to that maid from their very first encounter? He had never acted that way towards other maids. If he saw her again, could he figure out why? But she was gone now. There was no point dwelling on it. They wouldn't meet again anyway. He heard a sound. It was the communication channel with Hauntain, confirming it was working. He had never used it, but why would Hauntain suddenly go to the Holy Kingdom to propose to that maid? What was that scoundrel up to now? Perhaps those behind the imposter were connected to the past. How could His Majesty and Mello keep such a crucial truth from Perry? They were withholding everything out of concern. So this was the same thing she and Phoenix had discussed. They simply cared about her. Even if they had kept secrets, it didn't change the fact that they were on her side. Regardless, if she had known beforehand, she would have carried out the mission the same way. Therefore, there was no need to dwell on useless thoughts. She had to focus on the future. Knowing that the Wandam family was involved in her mother's death and the events within the tower, what she needed to do now was investigate them thoroughly. But to get close to them, she needed to exert political pressure, and the most suitable power resided solely with the S's family. But to gain the S's family support, she would have to reveal her true identity as Perrianne. Wait, Mello already knew the connection between the imposter and her mother's incident. He must have reached a similar conclusion. But despite that, he hadn't told her anything. What a fool. She stormed into Mello's office, having just left dejectedly, now barging back in like a madwoman. She returned because she knew he would overthink things. He must be thinking about how to approach Roxart, and concluded that using the S's family is the most effective method. He's probably agonizing over whether he should reveal the truth about her being the Duke's daughter. But what's the point of these foolish thoughts? Even if they need the S's family's help, how could they possibly expose the truth? He can't do this to her. For the Holy Kingdom, she can be amicable towards the S's family. It won't hurt her pride. But the reason she has to do this is because they can't fight the Western Empire alone. Avenging her mother and uncovering the truth, the 8 years of work leading up to this, and a mission to eliminate Rockstar, all of this belongs to her. If this continues, their nation will never be independent. This is something they must accomplish themselves. She said before that she would make the kingdom strong again through her own efforts. He remembers little Perry asking him if he saw her capabilities, that she would make the kingdom powerful. Now that the Holy Kingdom is her home, the girl hasn't changed a bit. He was worried she would be devastated by learning about the past, but it seems his worries were unnecessary. Then, to eliminate Rockstar, they first need to interrogate that fake Duke's daughter. What did Cecil say? They haven't gotten the information they need. She thought Cecil would tell her something about the monster byproducts. More investigation is needed. He knows she's exceptionally capable, but the enemy isn't simple. He needs to be prepared for any situation. She doesn't want the Holy Kingdom to be harmed either, so she'll investigate everything thoroughly before taking action. Since there's no quick solution right now, they need to consider their next move. She trusts Mello. If he finds anything, he should tell her. She's getting ready to leave. Where's she going? With nothing to do now, she's going to her favorite theater. He lied again. He can't tell Perrianne that new information came to light during Cecil's interrogation. Using the byproducts means they researched their application by killing a large number of people. Cecil doesn't know the details of where so many bodies came from. She hasn't killed anyone herself. They brought back bodies from somewhere that hadn't yet decayed, and she found it strange. The strangest thing is that most of the bodies share a similar appearance, resembling the Duke's daughter, Perrianne. A large number of bodies were also used in the monster research, but there's no record of any large-scale disappearances anywhere. However, if those bodies look like Perry, they're likely the dolls Perry made while surviving in the tower. These creatures had drained her to the bone, completely erasing even the traces of embroidery from her desperate struggles. Until now, he's been hiding the fact that Perry was their target and that they used the dolls for their own gain. But how long can he keep it hidden? When she learns the whole truth, will she still be able to act like she is now? Even after all this time, nothing has changed here. What should she watch today? In truth, she has special memories of the theater. When she was rescued from the tower, and all adults were terrifying to her, Her Majesty the Queen brought her to the theater in disguise. The adults she saw in the performance weren't the frightening ones she feared in the tower. They are beautiful creatures who save children, the Queen had said. Adults usually protect children. From that moment, Perry began to heal, even before her first visit to the theater. She went almost every day, but having already pieced together the truth, she sought only to relive the memories. Then, a voice called out to her from behind. It was Hauntain, looking for her. What was he doing here? She offered a hesitant greeting. What was his plan, coming to the Holy Kingdom? Had he truly discovered her identity? She didn't know his reasons, but for now, it seemed best to play along. He asked how she was doing. Everything was fine, she replied, but why was he here? Was he truly here to see the performance? No, if that were the case, there would be no need to seek her out specifically. He had come to talk, and judging by his deliberate approach, it wasn't going to be a casual conversation. What could he possibly want to discuss? Then he proposed. Perhaps he had been impressed by the contractual marriages common here. His performances were renowned. She had seen them several times herself. If he had simply come to see the show, she would have explained everything. Seeing her reaction, he seemed to regret his impulsive proposal. If not for that, why would he propose? It certainly didn't seem to be out of affection. In any case, he decided it best to start with an explanation and suggested they move to a different location. He asked if she frequented the cafe. It was unassuming and pleasant, though in reality, the largest in the Holy Kingdom. She had assumed he'd come here after learning her true identity, but judging by his lack of close observation, he seemed to think she was just an ordinary person. But based on all the facts gathered so far, it was highly likely Hauntain knew she was the Duke's true daughter. He likely didn't know she was a spy, or that she could control Earth magic, or about her connection to the royal family. She could relax just a little. So, why the proposal? As she suspected, it wasn't born of romantic feelings. It had to do with his family. On the surface, the Windham family seemed to have no problems, but there were factions within the family opposing his claim as the heir, even going so far as to sway his loyal servants and set traps. Initially, he had intended to endure until he officially inherited the dukedom, but things were escalating. He couldn't stand idly by any longer, but there was a limit to what he could accomplish alone. He was prepared to seriously address the issue of succession. However, there was a significant obstacle. It wouldn't be easy to become the heir without being married, but he didn't want to marry someone he had no interest in. The search for a suitable partner had dragged on. He had thought of her when they met at the peace negotiation dinner. For the sake of peace, they had to resolve the issues and leave, but he kept thinking about the hardships she had endured. He wanted her to be happy, and if he had to have a bride, he wanted it to be Perry. This man was truly spouting such earnest nonsense. Factions opposing his position. That couldn't be the whole story. All opposing factions had been purged. The only powerful faction remaining belonged to Hauntain himself. Claiming he couldn't inherit without marriage was a lie. He simply hadn't taken over yet, but the current Duke and Duchess were practically powerless. And to say he wanted her happiness with such a chilling expression, he'd been lying through his teeth the entire time. Just recently, in front of the theater, she'd brought up the contract marriage. He'd been against the idea of a contractual marriage for years. She could make demands of him. She'd tried. He couldn't even fathom her refusing. Should she teach this blasted man a lesson? She understood what he was saying, but couldn't seem to give him an answer. What did he want? There wasn't anything inherently wrong with what he was saying. If there was anything she desired, he would do it. But this wasn't about conditions at all. She simply didn't like Hauntain, and regardless, he would pretend this conversation never happened. She left first, and then the door burst open. Who had opened the cafe door so abruptly? It was Perrianne. What was he doing here? He began by asking if she was going to marry Hauntain. How did he know all this? Judging by his expression, it was Hauntain's doing. She wondered what the Duke had heard from Hauntain. They had indeed talked about marriage, but it was a light-hearted jest, nothing serious. Perhaps he orchestrated this charade, summoning Perrianne urgently. But the Duke had replied that Perry was speaking troubling words. The Duke couldn't just say that. Perry wasn't an ordinary citizen of the Holy Kingdom. Due to the impersonation incident, she was in the spotlight. In this situation, if he said he wanted to marry her, the public would be abuzz. Hauntain already knew this, but what if his heart already belonged to Perry? The reason he gave the Duke was that he didn't want to create the illusion that this was politically motivated. He was willing to risk everything for her. What other reason could there be for objecting? Perhaps it was personal feelings. He packaged it well. He'd likely already considered how to handle this situation, and now he was acting according to plan. But he made one big mistake. He dragged her into this. He looked at her with an arrogant expression, thinking about how to use her. It reminded her of what happened at the academy. If that was the case, then a change of plans was in order. There was no need to quietly investigate the Vendhams. She wasn't quite sure why he wanted to use her, but she now understood his feelings. If Hauntain decided to use her, she hadn't expected him to be so sincere. She, too, had to use this opportunity. She agreed to marry him. From the moment he came to use her, he had already lost. During her time at the academy, to practice her skills, she would distract the attendants in the hallways and observe people. She stumbled upon Hauntain and immediately recognized him as a profoundly cunning individual. It might be difficult for others to notice, but she, the only one observing him every moment, was able to recognize this. On the surface, he was impeccable, excellent, kind of everyone, but in reality, it was as if he were sorting meat, promoting those capable of success and devaluing those he deemed worthless. He categorized people according to his own rules. If his motives were malicious, his actions could have been called inhumane, but in her eyes, there was no personal animosity in his actions. It was as if it were his duty, as if he felt responsible for controlling everyone. By his standards, foreigners from weaker countries like her seemed to be treated like trash that needed to be cleaned up. The original, ordinary members of the group had been replaced. The newly appointed ones were all raving lunatics, and it was highly unlikely to be a coincidence. To avoid trouble, she had to tread carefully. One of them asked where she was from, inquiring if the rumors about the Holy Kingdom were true, that their queen used her body for diplomacy, and that was why she frequently traveled abroad. She'd resorted to violence because they insulted her majesty, the very queen who had saved her. That was the long and short of the incident at the academy. Now, she felt no remorse for her actions, but at the time, it had become a huge issue for the academy. There was even talk of expulsion. Her Majesty and Mello had both looked out for her when they sent her to this academy. It was then that Hauntain appeared before her. If he had come to see her make a fool of herself, he certainly had, but he merely asked if she was upset. It was her first and last meeting with him. The incident, which should have ended in expulsion, was apparently resolved thanks to Hauntain. Leveraging his position as the heir to the Wyndham family, the most influential family in the Western Empire, he persuaded both the victims and the academy. His usually expressive face was now unreadable, his actions betraying an attempt to conceal his calculations. She still didn't understand what it all meant. On the contrary, it would be better if she wasn't bothered anymore. Simply graduating from the academy without incident was enough. She was certain it wasn't a big deal, but if he took any further action toward her, the conversation would change. The Duke was pleased that she had accepted Hauntain's proposal, and she decided to meet with him later to discuss the engagement in detail. First, she had to speak with Duke Exer, who had come all this way, and explain the whole situation. The fact that she, a former servant of the Exer family of the Eastern Empire, would become the lady of the Wyndham family of the Western Empire could become a political issue. Hauntain agreed that clarifying his stance was important, then left the matter to her and departed. Perrianne had come all this way to help, but it was all for naught. Did she truly believe she would become a duchess? He assumed she understood how to weigh the pros and cons. After all, she had once petitioned the former duke for national sovereignty. But now she had lost her last lifeline, blinded by a fantasy beyond her grasp. If he was worried about Perry slandering the Exer family, he could rest assured. She was just a servant. She had no secrets to divulge. Did he really think that was what he was worried about? Then what was he truly concerned about? She knew why he cared about her and spoke so formally. It was because Lady Perrianne was still important to him. He admired and respected her more than anyone, so much so that he unconsciously used honorifics with a servant who resembled her. What could she possibly know by saying these things? Perhaps nothing at all. He had come to the Duke's estate for her, but she had vanished. Perry couldn't imagine how he felt. But in this situation, he hadn't run away. He had accepted his position. Since she resembled the Duke's daughter, she also had something to say. Now he could forget Perrianne. That's what she wanted to tell Perrianne. She had to get that message to him. Even without Perry's presence, Hauntain was already everything she had hoped he would be. He was influenced by the Exers because of her, no longer weakened by Perrianne's existence. April would live solely for her own happiness now, so she couldn't afford to wallow in sadness. The sharp words crossed a line. He wasn't so weak and pathetic that he needed comforting from someone of lower standing. He should be angry, and he knew she was a completely different person now. But every time she was in front of him, he was speechless. Why was she suddenly giving him this advice? She had no right to say those things, but it simply meant that from today onwards, he no longer needed to look after her. Just as he'd said, Perry was a calculating individual. She had accepted Hauntain's proposal not only so he could use her, but also unconcerned that Hauntain might use her. So, he no longer needed to worry about her. Hearing it directly from her, he could finally understand. He hadn't come here out of concern that Hauntain would hurt her, and certainly not because he saw her as a replacement for Perrianne. He had come here, so fiercely driven to stop the marriage with Hauntain, perhaps because she was simply herself. Damn it, 3 days had already passed since Hauntain's proposal. News of their engagement had shocked the world. The fairy tale romance between the heir to the Western Empire's dukedom and a maid working in the Eastern Empire's Duke Exer's household had sent ripples across the continent. Moreover, he had proposed just yesterday, and the wedding was already set for 3 months later. She had no plans for the next 3 months and nowhere else to work now. He was speaking the truth, but why did it make her so angry? With everything progressing so smoothly, they were now heading to the Western Empire for the wedding, a fact that had people talking about her every day. Articles were popping up everywhere, speculating that the Duke had been brainwashed to make such a decision, and others dissecting the style of the maid who had captured the Duke's heart. Hauntain handed her a newspaper with the headline, "National Treasure Number 3 Luxury Train Departs. Is this maid truly worth it?" Perry asked him to stop reading. Hauntain replied that there was no need to be upset. Wasn't it interesting to see what people were saying? As the subject of the gossip, she wasn't amused in the slightest. In any case, from the newspaper he was showing her, it was clear they were currently on the Western Empire's national treasure, a massive train traversing the Western Empire. The train, composed of dozens of interconnected cars, was a flying train originally designed for the travel of the wealthy. This time, however, wasn't being used for its intended purpose, but specifically for introductions. Before the wedding, a tour of the Western Empire was planned, allowing her to meet the local nobility. It was essential for her to meet them, and Hauntain had devised this method. The guests would be arriving shortly, all coming to see her. Hauntain asked her not to disappoint them. She addressed him formally, which surprised him. He asked her to call him Sunbai. Perry agreed. Well, they would soon be arriving at their first destination, so she needed to be ready. The Duke and Duchess of Wyndham would be the first aboard. These were the Duke and Duchess of Wyndham, the people who were about to become her in-laws. Whispers rippled through the air. This was Perry's first encounter with them. How would they treat her? Considering they had chartered an entire luxury train, surely they would be courteous. But her background, Perry curtsied, offered greetings, and introduced herself. The Duchess, however, merely glanced at her and moved on. The Duke offered a brief, perfunctory, "Pleased to meet you," before following his wife. The Duchess's reaction, she clearly disapproved of her prospective daughter-in-law's origins. But to so openly disregard her in public wasn't meant as a personal slight against Perry. It was because of Xavier's melancholia. Xavier Wyndham, a woman of noble birth, had lived her entire life amidst the upper crust of society. She was known for her fastidiousness and sensitivity. But according to investigations, she wasn't hysterical, just deeply afflicted by a melancholic disposition. However, the root of the melancholy lay within the family. Unlike a physical ailment, there was no clear cure, and this condition persisted, leaving her without the energy to even acknowledge others. He said he decorated the train's conservatory. Who knew he'd replicate the one at the ducal estate? What was Hauntain thinking? And out of all the potential suitors, he chose a girl who looked just like that servant girl. Seeing her in person, the servant girl resembled her even more than she'd imagined. Lady Perrianne, the Duke of Perrianne's daughter, whom she'd met long ago. Pandurnian dreamt again of himself and young Perry, choosing a book to read for the day. The Tale of the Kraken. Isn't she a bit too fond of these monster story collections? And so he began to read. Once upon a time, there was a little Kraken princess, the youngest daughter in the land of the Krakens. Pandurnian's brother burst into his room. It's an important day, and Larian's still lazing about. Get him moving. He'll be moving out soon enough. But Larian was lost in thought, realizing he hadn't dreamed of Perry in a long time, and reluctant to wake. It didn't matter, though. Soon he would see that longed-for face again, for he was going to meet the servant girl who resembled Lady Perrianne. It was said that Hauntain was touring the Western Empire on the National Treasure train, all for the sake of an engagement to a servant girl. Their Duke, shocked by the news, had ordered a visit to the Western Empire under the pretense of checking on the girl. Whatever the reason, he was glad to see a face so similar to Perry's after all this time. Meanwhile, on the train, a young lady suggested Perry try some of the Western Empire's sweets. She sat amongst the noble women, sipping tea, all of them striving to emulate her. It seemed the daughter of Duke Lehman of the Western Empire had suddenly become so amiable, despite having gossiped about Perry behind her back until recently. One look at her face, and Perry knew she believed Perry had used some vulgar tactic to ensnare Hauntain. It was unlikely she was trying to humiliate Perry by acting haughty on her own turf, or perhaps, after witnessing the Duchess of Wyndham's attitude, she felt a sense of superiority. The others were the same. She could ignore the whispers behind her back. But the main problem was that this was a constantly moving train, vibrating every second. Her earthen familiars, crafted from tiny fragments, struggled to maintain their form amidst the train's constant vibrations, beginning to crumble. To hold their shape, they needed to be larger, but that made espionage more difficult as they needed to be placed inconspicuously. Duke Lehman's daughter spoke again, her voice laced with a cloying sweetness. She'd heard, she said, that Perry had been a maid in the Eastern Empire. Did Lord Hauntain know the truth? Such a thing could become problematic if kept hidden from one's future husband, she mused, feigning concern. Since Perry wasn't afraid of the current atmosphere, she decided to let the open insult stand. One could, in principle, play along. A voice, familiar to Perry, answered the girl from behind her, stating that Hauntain knew everything and was, in fact, delighted. It was Juris. How had she gotten here? Perry hadn't even known she was on the train. The noble girl, affronted by this unexpected interruption, bristled. Who was this woman? Juris introduced herself as Perry's, the bride-to-be's, personal guard. Perry, bewildered, asked Juris why she was here. Juris explained that, being from the Western Empire, she was returning to find work. She'd been remarkably fortunate, she added, her friend having hired her immediately. Who had hired her? Why, her future husband, of course, the very same who had arranged for her to be Perry's companion. On the surface, he appeared the doting fiancé, concerned for his lonely bride. But he hadn't mentioned assigning her a guard. Perry wondered if Hauntain had bribed Juris, a disquieting thought that planted a seed of suspicion. Juris, seemingly oblivious to Perry's inner turmoil, inquired if there was room in the compartment. It was, after all, intended for couples, and they were already sharing a bed. What a mischievous girl, Perry thought, grappling with more serious matters. Regardless, she was relieved to see Juris and felt a sense of ease, knowing she would have a familiar presence. They would be seeing a lot of each other from now on. Time flew by, and the train reached another destination. It was time, once again, to entertain the high-ranking guests. As Hauntain had requested, Perry, impeccably dressed, made the rounds, introducing herself and engaging in meaningless conversations. Thus, the second week passed without a single moment of respite. Today, the train stopped at the Imperial Palace. Hauntain, ever solicitous, inquired if she was tired. The sunlight startled her. She found it difficult to keep up with him, his effortless charm never faltering as he conversed with the endless stream of nobles. This, he explained, was what a duke had to do. Though exhausting, she had to persevere. Today was a crucial day, a day for meeting important guests. They would be visiting the Imperial Palace of the Western Empire, and among those boarding the train at the palace was Roxanne Vendôme, the suspect in the murder of her mother and the deployment of her false father, the very case that had ultimately led to her imprisonment in the Tower. In truth, her animosity towards him stemmed from more than just as being a suspect in that case. During her time at the Western Empire Academy, at the tender age of 17, she'd heard rumors of weapons being developed in the Imperial factory and had gone to investigate personally. From the moment she entered, a sense of unease had settled upon her. It was, after all, no ordinary factory, a fact that would escape the notice of commoners. But from the moment she left, she was certain, deep beneath the ground where she now stood, hidden within the depths of the dungeons, lay a secret space. She descended the stairs cautiously, witnessing the human experimentation masked as weapons research. Using her abilities, she triggered an earthquake, collapsing the building and capturing the perpetrators alive. They were brought to the Holy Kingdom. During the interrogation, their shocking objective was revealed: to research and create the perfect bioweapon. Perry noticed something peculiar. Usually, when people aim to create something magnificent, they try to incorporate as many excellent traits as possible. But these researchers focused on elimination, eliminating pain, eliminating self-awareness, thereby stripping away emotions. They wanted to create perfect weapons unaffected by feelings. In other words, beings that could no longer be called human. Upon learning that the factory belonged to Roxer, she concluded her investigation. But it was highly likely that Hauntain had also been affected by the experiments. Perhaps the unease she felt while observing him at the academy was related to this. Judging and controlling others as if it were a divine duty. Perhaps emotions had been removed to create the ideal ruler. Hauntain interrupted her thoughts, asking what she was thinking about. He pinched her cheek, seeing her tension, wanting to help her relax. She felt indignant at the gesture. It was his way of easing tension, and he believed it helped. But earlier, looking at Hauntain, she found it strange that such an unfeeling person acted so childishly towards her. She didn't think she was particularly special to him, but objectively, it was odd. The train would soon arrive at the Imperial Palace. Hauntain asked if she wanted to go to the reception room in advance. She needed to focus now. She would soon face the possible culprit behind all these events. Not only Roxer, but she would also meet Larian and Exeter. Although she had checked beforehand through the Earth spirits, seeing this combination in person felt even stranger. Roxanne greeted Hauntain, the man possibly connected to his mother's death. And then there was this fellow attending the Western Empire's event. A madman obsessed with his family's past. He didn't even seem to know who was beside him. Then Roxer asked if this was the rumored bride. He requested Hauntain to introduce his bride, as she would also become a member of his family. The bride he had brought with such difficulty. Perry was glad her turn had finally come. She had rehearsed the encounter with Roxer several times, so she wasn't nervous. She just needed to stay calm. The pitch-black night sky, Roxer's smiling gaze. She remembered this scene from when she was locked in the tower. He had said they needed not just a body, but an intact one. Any good method would do, right? Maybe he should try suffocating her with smoke. Suddenly, Perry began to choke, clutching her throat. Roxanne asked with concern if she was all right. She couldn't breathe. The smoke continued to torment her. She cried out for her parents, her brothers, for help. Xavier rushed to Perry, taking her hand and asking if she was okay. That star-like hair, it was what she longed to see while suffering in the tower. Xavier rushed to Perry, holding her hand and asking if she was all right. That star-like hair, it was what she longed to see while suffering in the tower. But it was too late now. None of it mattered. Just as Juris suspected, the man who entered the reception room was indeed Roxer Von Dome. He passed by without recognizing her. Perry and Hauntain must have already met in the waiting room. If she were to grow closer to Roxanne after her marriage, how would she handle it? They had entered the reception room not long ago. Why? Why was that man holding Perry? Perry awoke. Where was she? She had just been in the waiting room. If she remembered correctly, the moment she saw Roxer, memories of the tower came flooding back. How could she have forgotten those memories for so long? What Roxer and the others had done to her when they found her. They were glad they didn't have to risk stealing people anymore. They were glad they now had a way to safely transport materials. They hadn't anticipated the ability to create dolls that were identical to humans. Dealing with the monsters required human bodies. They turned her, a doll, into a corpse to be used against the monsters. Her abilities were useful to them. If it weren't for those abilities, the processing of the monster products wouldn't have developed so much. She knew it wasn't her fault. If it weren't for her, they would have carried out mass killings in the villages, continuing to supply test subjects. So her abilities saved people. That was enough. Her suffering wasn't meaningless. However, in those memories of the tower, besides Roxer's people, she had met someone else. Who was it? She had seen him for the first time then. He didn't look scary. On the contrary, he shone like a prince. Come to think of it, that boy looked like Larian. That child should be around this age now. Could that boy really have been Larian? If so, it made perfect sense why he was so sure of her death, because she had died in front of him. But why would Larian be in the tower? Juris entered. This was her room. When Perry lost consciousness, she had brought her here, but she had been outside the reception room. So, Xavier had carried her out when she fainted. He must have been afraid of causing unnecessary rumors, so he brought her to her room. The former employer carrying out the bride-to-be must have caused quite a stir. There were already enough rumors about her coming from Exer. How could Hauntain leave her with Xavier? If he truly cared for her, how could he do that? Juris was genuinely worried about her. Perry tried to stay on guard when Juris came to attend to her, but it seemed she wasn't in league with Hauntain. She thanked Juris. She continued to act as if nothing was wrong. She had said the same thing when she was suffering at the hands of the Duke's fake daughter. What was she thinking? To just faint like that. The bride was weaker than he thought, but when he saw her face, he was quite surprised. She looked exactly like Ex's daughter, the one he had seen in the tower. Of course she did, because Perry was Duke X's biological daughter. But there was no need to tell him that truth. A girl who had nothing but being the former Duke's daughter and couldn't even acknowledge it, acting entirely on her emotions. Even if she resisted, Roxer would win in the end. It was an obvious fact, predetermined, that didn't require his intervention. So, these moments on the train are just fleeting entertainment, soon to disappear. How did she feel when she arrived? He was so terrified when she fainted. He hadn't realized how difficult this forced marriage was for her. He should have paid more attention. The thought of Larian carrying her away was sickening. He'd clearly ignored everything on purpose, fully aware of the rumors that would spread. But if he continued this charade, she wouldn't give in either. It was disappointing that he hadn't even noticed her condition. She had trusted him by coming here. She knew he needed a sham marriage. But even so, she believed he'd chosen her because he felt something for her, at least a little. If that were true, then let him prove it with actions, not words, so she wouldn't have to worry. They both knew their feelings weren't love. They were trying to use each other, but in the end, she, not he, would be the victor. That much was certain, no matter how she looked at it. This place was exactly like the Duchess's greenhouse, the place where Alice had once been. Perry arrived at the greenhouse and found the Duchess, exactly who she needed. She offered a greeting, explaining that she had come to discuss future plans with Duchess Saver. She needed the Duchess on her side. Though the Duchess appeared listless and indifferent, perhaps due to depression, Perry could still sense a deep-rooted arrogance. Making friends wouldn't be easy, but Perry had a secret weapon, the charm of a daughter-in-law, bright as the summer sun. But the real point wasn't charm, but modern medicine and pleasant conversation. She'd slipped a small dose into the food and tea, and it should be taking effect soon. As for why she'd come to the greenhouse, Perry explained that she was unfamiliar with the Empire and its customs, and found it difficult to interact with high-ranking individuals. But if she continued to avoid people, what would become of her in Von Dome? She wanted to learn everything from the Duchess. Would she allow it? Had the drugs not taken effect yet? Wanting to engage the Duchess in conversation, Perry agreed, but first, she had to say pew. Was pew some kind of slang or code? What did it even mean? Perry apologized, admitting she didn't know what pew meant. Could the Duchess explain? If she didn't know, it was fine. If Perry had something to say, she should just say it. She wanted to talk to Lady Saver. Perry mentally urged the Duchess not to make her repeat herself. Clearly, getting closer to her today would be difficult. It was only the first day. There was no need to rush. It was best to leave after a moderate amount of conversation, leaving those little green, whatever they were. She simply wanted to show the Duchess what kind of person she was. She knew others didn't think highly of her, and she wasn't going to ignore their judgments. However, even if the Duchess disliked her, Perry hoped she wouldn't judge her solely based on the opinions of others. What was with Saver's expression? She looked even more withdrawn than before. And looking at her, Perry felt like the Duchess was lost in some distant memory. As predicted, Duchess Saver hadn't intended to converse with Perry, let alone grow closer. However, outright dismissing a visiting guest wouldn't do. She offered tea. Perry, unsure of the Duchess's change of heart, nonetheless accepted the invitation and returned, bringing sweets to accompany the tea. 3 weeks drifted by in this manner. Perry observed Saver's eating habits, diligently attempting to treat her melancholy and ensuring she received proper nourishment. As a result, the Duchess noticed a newfound calmness in Perry's presence. This was, in truth, due to the medication for her depression, but Perry simply replied that she, too, was pleased by their growing closeness. Their first meeting in the greenhouse had stirred something in the Duchess. The girl, Perry, reminded her so much of Alice. Silently, she questioned the late Duchess, seeking guidance on how to interpret this strange turn of events. Fontaine, busy all day, decided to return early thanks to Perry. Ever since her collapse, he had granted her freedom of movement, only to find her returning late each night. Even if their relationship wasn't a simple courtship, she hadn't even feigned an attempt to approach him since that day. He had to do something. Fontaine sought out Roxer. What was he doing here so late? Hadn't his fiancée returned yet? Come to think of it, she had been constantly by Saver's side recently. Fontaine changed the subject. There was a grand ball in 2 weeks. He would choose another girl as his partner for that night. Roxer was taken aback. Who? then would be his bride. This was a ball with attendees of global importance. It would be embarrassing for her to attend such an event alone. What did it matter if she came alone? She had nothing to do with him. He was saying he would abandon his fiancée and escort another woman. Just as he suspected, Hontane's heart wasn't truly engaged. When he saw the bride's picture, he was astonished. She looked so much like him. He thought the girl from the tower had survived, but no matter how he investigated, he couldn't find anything suspicious. This girl simply resembled the Duke's daughter. If she were that monster, Hontane would have noticed something and told him, because Hontane's body was partially merged with Lady Perrianne's puppet. It seemed he had told her to be stiller than still water, lower than the grass. Greetings, Princess of the Western Empire. So that was how she ended up in this situation. Roxer, he needed to learn to mask his emotions. Despicable traitor. The princess being here changed nothing, now or in the future. Perry sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend why the princess of the Western Empire would be confined in Roxer's office. The reason Roxer became regent and abused the princess and the emperor was because the previous emperor and empress died on the same day. The imperial faction, attempting to gain custody of the children, was ousted by the noble faction led by Duke Vendôme, leaving them powerless. What followed was the noble faction's neglect of the two children. Their goal was to crush the spirit and pride of those who followed the late emperor. It was a show of force. Once domestic affairs stabilized, he would place the prince, named after him, on the throne as emperor. The princess was supposed to inherit the throne, but Roxer insisted on a male succession law that existed only in ancient texts, thus pushing the prince forward. The princess had been prepared to inherit the throne since childhood, and she was clearly the most suitable candidate to rule. The princess seemed to have lost her position in an instant, but thankfully, there was no look of defeat in her eyes as she stared at Roxer. Perry recalled the time she had infiltrated the Western Empire's palace, secretly bringing powdered milk and food to these abandoned children. Even though the princess was younger then than she was now, she remained strong and unyielding. Perry was glad she hadn't lost hope. For her further plans, she needed the princess's cooperation. Incidentally, the Duchess said the princess would come to the meeting place tomorrow. The next day, they found themselves in a tall tower on a train, which surprised Perry. The Duchess replied that it was all a crystallization of magic and science, and Perry thought she wasn't romantic at all. She hadn't expected to be able to converse with her so calmly. The Duchess Savor's condition had clearly improved. Unlike the first time, she could now be with Perry naturally. She was glad the gentleman had agreed to her request for a walk. For depression, medication was important, but exercise was equally so. A staff member approached Savor, reporting that the princess and the emperor had entered the tower and that she had ordered them summoned. Even though her route intersected with the princess's, she had been worried about how to encounter her naturally. She hadn't expected Savor to summon them. The train stopped at the imperial palace, but because of her weak constitution, she couldn't bow to the emperor. Even though it was something that had to be done, the Duchess said. It turned out she hadn't called them for personal reasons, but for her. After all, beneath her outward coldness, she had a warm heart. Hello, Princess of the Western Empire, Emperor Roxer of the Western Empire. The princess glared at her, asking if she was the one who was to become Hontane's wife. Of course, she harbored hostility towards her, as she was the enemy to her. Nevertheless, she confirmed it. It seemed Hontane had lowered his standards quite a bit, perhaps because she wasn't a noble and didn't even know how to show respect when she saw the princess. She bowed to the emperor and princess and apologized for helping her while concealing her identity. The princess listened intently, but in the shortest amount of time, she had grown into someone wary of others. The help she had offered wasn't anything special, but pride still trumped all. The young emperor began to fidget restlessly in the princess's arms. She didn't understand what was happening, but he demanded Perry hold him. Did he instinctively remember the times she had secretly delivered things and comforted him with hugs? But now her mood was completely different. Duchess Savor was very curious, having heard that the emperor was extremely shy. The princess thought the emperor had slightly misunderstood, and that they should stop there for today and talk again next time. Perry hadn't had a chance to say anything, but stopped the princess to ask if she liked sweets though she would have to pass them on. Perry suddenly talking about this made people laugh for days, but that wasn't the point. These candies were made by her friend and could maintain the optimal body temperature, both delicious and magical. She had brought them along in case she encountered them. The princess couldn't understand the significance of the candy. It brought back unwelcome memories. Roxer, it seemed, deliberately ignored the times they lacked even the most basic necessities. During those desperate times, a benefactor had appeared, providing everything from powdered milk to blankets. They had been given all they needed. She believed the Imperial faction was still active, still supporting them. No matter how difficult things became, she couldn't afford to lose hope. But these candies, they weren't necessities. They weren't even the sort of thing one would give a child. It felt as though the candies were meant specifically for her, a condescending gesture, treating her like a child. It irritated her. Though she disliked sweets, she picked them up. She couldn't disregard someone's kindness. She reasoned, and so she would accept them. Perry had noticed her meager living quarters last time. These candies, imbued with a warming magic, would help her sleep comfortably. And the note Perry had left, claiming them as a gift, would prevent Roxer from confiscating them easily. No matter how Roxer perceived her, she was Hauntaine's wife. Ever since she'd glimpsed Roxer's room through her familiar, she'd been worried. The gift of the candies, however, brought a sliver of reassurance. Saber's reaction was colder than Perry anticipated. Her paternal family belonged to the Imperial faction. Perry had expected more sympathy towards them both. She thought that once the princess ascended the throne, they could almost be allies. As the Duchess mused, not all children were beautiful. Was she truly speaking about the Emperor? How could she speak that way? She refrained from comparing him to Hauntaine's childhood appearance, conceding that he looked decent enough. But more importantly, Duke Perrianne's daughter was exceptionally beautiful. How could Saber know about her childhood? Saber continued, remarking on what a lovely child she had been. Mr. Ellis, it seemed, often boasted about her. The Duchess of the Western Empire knew her mother from somewhere. She had met with Mrs. Ellis, a good woman, taken too soon. If she were still alive, perhaps. A strange thought flickered through her mind. This conversation couldn't simply be brushed aside. This concerned him as well. Could he join them? Why was Larion appearing during such an important conversation? He dreamt of his sister today, a good omen, he decided, since he was hearing a good story. About her dream. What a nuisance. She asked Duchess Saber to send the bothersome man away. If he insisted on joining, however, there was nothing she could do. This conversation did, after all, concern him. She was merely an outsider here, and couldn't object. So, the Duchess began to recount her first encounter with Ellis. But given the timing of their meeting, the Western and Eastern empires must have completely severed diplomatic ties. Alice had arrived alone at the Duchess's residence, the location of which Perry didn't know. Her mother was one of the 7 swords of the Eastern Empire. This could easily escalate into a military issue. And yet, she had secretly entered the residence of someone in an enemy nation. Even having heard about her from Elberry, Perry found her mother to be an extraordinary person. But every time she heard stories like this, she struggled to reconcile them with the mother she knew. His mother, Alice, was capable of things others couldn't even dream of. She was the most remarkable person he'd ever known. Perhaps she'd foreseen the eventual reconciliation between the Western and Eastern empires and had come to establish a connection in advance. Who could say? Duchess Saber certainly didn't understand her motives. Mr. Ellis himself had come to the estate, bringing Perrianne to meet her. Larion was unaware that his mother frequently took his sister, Perry, along on her travels. Later, there was talk of a marriage between Perry and Hauntaine, but it amounted to nothing more than rumors. No concrete action was ever taken. That was the extent of it. There wasn't any particularly significant relationship between them, so there were no other memories to share. Larion thanked Duchess Saber for sharing such a precious story and promised to visit again, but the Duchess, clearly wanting him gone, urged him to leave. It was best not to get too close to him. Larion had behaved normally today, but she knew him to be a strange man. She disliked him. The Duchess was pleased to hear this. Now that he was finally gone, they could speak frankly about Alice. She would tell the real story about her mother. There were things she hadn't revealed to Larion, but why would she tell him? After all, Larion was Mr. Ellis's son. How could she share such intimate details? Some conversations were meant to be held only between women. The truth was, Alice had come to help a foolish woman. That foolish woman was her past self, a duchess who had simply given up on life. Born into a pro-imperial ducal family, when the empire was established, she had grown up amidst the privilege of the high nobility. As a lady of a prominent ducal house, she had naturally become the mistress of Vendôme. After the birth of Hauntain, that terrifyingly intelligent heir, there seemed to be nothing left in the world for her to envy. News of the Eastern Empire's duchess frequently circulated, stories that supposedly led to many resignations. She'd thought it irrelevant to her own life. She was already living the best life imaginable, with no reason to compete or feel jealous. That was, until her husband brought home an illegitimate child. Her world began to crumble. The child, acknowledged as her husband's son, was brought into the ducal estate, and she could do nothing but watch in silence. One day, she was told she could treat the child however she pleased. No one would fault her. Roxer himself assured her that even his brother, the boy's true father, wouldn't be able to reprimand her. She knew this, but even if the child was born with tainted blood, it wasn't his fault. As expected of her, she never lost her noble composure. Of course, because she was perfect in that regard. One couldn't lose their temper over a bastard. And besides, she had Hauntain, the perfect child. Her son was already reading such difficult books. He could help. Hauntain was her brilliant son, too intelligent to be compared to that bastard child. He could handle it himself. His mother shouldn't concern herself. At that age, didn't children need their parents' help? No, not only did he not need it, but it seemed she was a nuisance to him. She had always been perfect, but that perfection had been shattered by her husband's betrayal, and now her child didn't need her. So why did she even exist? No one needed her. Not a single person wanted to understand her. It seemed the rumors about the Duchess. The rumors about Vendôme are true. She hasn't invited anyone here. Who is she? This Duchess from the Eastern Empire is controlling the war. Vendôme's soldiers should be guarding the entrance. How'd you get in? Did she really take care of them all? They say the Duchess is hysterical, falling apart more each day. Who would dare insult her like that? Alice had read in a parenting book that children without guardians easily become withdrawn, and that's exactly what she went through. But it just so happens she needs to visit the Empire often, so she can look after them. They are equals, so they can communicate with each other. What is this woman talking about? She's not someone who needs looking after, nor someone to be pitied. How dare she speak as if she knows her, knows how much effort she's put in to become who she is now. This was the first time she lost her temper like this, started cursing and throwing things. She pitted those who lived completely different lives, but she couldn't stand this calm and composed woman. But at the same time, she felt relieved. Was she someone who could even get angry? She had been driven to this point. That's how their secret meetings began, but they couldn't agree on anything. She was too sensitive by nature, while Alice was more indifferent. Alice didn't understand all the things that worried her, like what if Hauntain was replaced by Galloway, even though he was a brilliant child now. Don't worry about such useless things. The Duke feels guilty towards her and will never abandon the child. Even if Jalone were more outstanding than Hauntain, he wouldn't show greed because he's grateful she didn't mistreat him. If such a thing really happened, worrying wouldn't solve anything. So these emotions are all meaningless. Is it really that hard to comfort someone with a few warm words? She only said that because it wasn't her business. She wondered if she could say such things when her sons pointed swords at each other for the heir's position. If they made such a decision, there must be a reason. She gave birth to them, but they live their own lives. Whether they fail or are unhappy is no longer her concern. No longer angry, she could continue venting her rage like the first meeting, mocking again. She had reason to be angry back then. She should be grateful she didn't report her. On the contrary, Saber should be grateful to her because she didn't make an extreme choice when she barged in. She thought she just came to see her like that. She came after hearing about the Duchess, found the will in her room. She knew she was on the edge and still barged in. If someone is grieving enough to want to die, they must be helped. So Alice knew everything from the beginning. What was this woman thinking? She did everything so casually and effortlessly, as if teasing, and acted as if she had transcended the despair others were experiencing. She also wanted to be as strong as Alice. She envied and admired Alice, living the life of a duchess who couldn't escape the stereotypical life of noble women. Despite that, she couldn't escape this life and couldn't help but feel sorry for Alice. They say the Duke of Eska had a bastard child. Everything is decided by hair color for them. Why would she do that? That hot-tempered woman, taking up with another man, knowing full well the Duchess Saver was already struggling with the illegitimate child. Impossible. Even if it were true, what right did he have to say such a thing? In the matter of the illegitimate child, that wasn't about Galloway, it was about the Duchess Saver. This was the first time she had resorted to violence. Even when she learned of Galloway's existence, she had tried to restrain herself. But why couldn't she control herself this time? She needed to hear it from Alice herself. What exactly happened? What was the truth? Alice had to come and tell her the truth herself before she went mad. With that same brazen expression she always wore, yet weeping as she spoke of her daughter's fragility. She had always thought Alice was superhuman, living a perfect life, untroubled by worries. But in reality, she was the most vulnerable person in the world, giving her daughter brown hair, a reason to be criticized for life, becoming even more fragile, giving love to the vulnerable. And Perrianne, whom she loved so deeply. She understood. This was a mother's heart. She was a child loved so deeply by her mother that it changed her life. She must remember this. Perrianne started to defend herself, saying she wasn't Perrianne, growing more agitated as she remembered the past. Because she looked like the Duke's daughter, Saver wouldn't pry in her life. There had to be a reason for keeping secrets. She just wanted to tell her how much Alice loved her. That's what she meant to her mother. Someone who changed her life. Someone who loved her enough to risk everything. She would cherish what her mother had wanted to protect so fiercely, and she wouldn't turn a blind eye to those who disregarded her. Let them watch. She would make them pay.